Once upon a time there was a world in which an organism received the gift of a second life every few hundred years. And a similar situation happened now. One man while in a coffin suddenly woke up and heard a quiet voice that spoke of an order from above which ordered to grant the grace of rebirth to the unrest soul of the deceased. When this man woke up, he was immediately very frightened because he could not understand where he was now and why it was so dark here. He remembered how some time ago he was just playing a game and clearly had not been in such creepy and dark places that day. While he was playing that game, after 2 days, he was finally able to destroy the boss that had been a problem for him for a long time. But after this happened, everything darkened in his eyes, and apparently this was the consequence of the fact that he ended up here in a wooden coffin. In addition to the fact that it was incredibly dark here, it was also very stuffy here since there was no fresh air. It was necessary to get out of here, and in a panic, the guy began to knock with his hand on the wooden lid of the coffin in order to attract attention to himself. But he was slightly frightened when he heard a quiet, gentle voice near him, which began to ask why there was any rush at all if the beautiful nights were always so short. Initially the guy did not understand what was the source of this sound and therefore asked himself in a quiet voice what this slippery and cold thing was. But turning his head he saw a young girl who asked why call her a thing like that if they were a happy married couple and such words could hurt her. The guy got even more scared and started screaming and asking who she was. But the girl was only surprised and asked him if he was really so ruthless that he didn't even remember his wife. Then realizing the whole situation, the guy apologized to the girl and said that he could not keep her company, at the same time asking for advice on how to get out of here since he had classes at the university tomorrow. In fact, he enjoyed the company of this woman, but the thought that this could be some kind of practical joke did not give him peace. Well, from the girl's eyes one could tell that she was clearly not lying and most likely was somehow connected with the guy. Moreover, it was difficult to deny the fact that this was most likely the most beautiful girl the guy had ever seen in his life. The silence was broken when the girl came closer and said that she understands that she has a very busy husband, but sometimes you need to give free rein to idleness. Approaching even closer, the woman's voice became quieter, and she said that she was just a wife who wanted her husband. 7 defeated opponents will become fierce wolves, and the moon will illuminate all the stars with sparkling rays. These words stuck in the guy's head for a long time. As soon as he heard them around his body, he suddenly saw the spread of some kind of energy and glowing hieroglyphs. It seemed to him that he had moved to another place which was at the same time incredibly strange and terribly familiar. This feeling gave him a false emotion of comfort from which it was difficult to get out and in which he wanted to stay longer. Meanwhile, near the building that was located not far from this coffin, one could now hear the sword flying through the air. After some time it flew into the man's hand, and then he said that the head of Chen, namely Hu Jin, committed a crime and received what he deserved. This man was a senior student of the Kuan Tong school named Lu Shi. He also added that he had an order to exhume Hu Jin and asked his interlocutor not to make his work difficult. Then his interlocutor said that he should not put so much pressure on their family since they lost their son that day, and this information clearly needs to be taken into account. Therefore he asked to simply leave the body of their own son alone and leave here in peace. But Lu Shi replied that now their spiritual strength corresponds to the strength of an ordinary cripple, and therefore they should not be so insolent. Then, with just one swing of his sword, he directed a stream of energy towards the parents of the deceased and thereby forced them to duck. Approaching closer and closer to the coffin, he loudly said that first he would chop Chen Hu Jin's body to shreds and then he would attack his parents. But just as he prepared to strike with his sword, an energy explosion of incredible magnitude occurred right next to the coffin. He, along with one of his assistants, flew to the side due to the amount of energy that began to spread in different directions. It was as amazing as it was powerful, and at the same time one could feel a strong vibration and a loud sound. After the explosion subsided, an image that looked like a man appeared right above the lid of the coffin. All the Kuan Tong members who helped Lu Shi were surprised that this happened, especially after they recognized this unknown person as the same Chen Hu Jin. His reaction was slightly strange since after such a spectacular appearance, he slowly and rather awkwardly descended to the floor. He felt very bad after kissing that girl, and he felt like he drank 10 tons of Coca-Cola. In addition, he suddenly felt a strong attack of vomiting and tried to cover his mouth with his hand in order to contain everything within himself. And he did it quite successfully, and when the woman standing next to him saw it, she only managed to shout 2 words. It was his mother, and with incredibly sincere joy she ran up and hugged her son. She began asking him various questions because she wanted to make sure that Hu Jin was safe. And the father who came up later asked his son how he was able to return from the other world. But this guy never answered anything, and moreover he just turned away and moved away a little from these people at that moment. I don't understand that they are his relatives. Adding to the problem was that he began to feel an incredibly strong pain in his head after hearing all these words, and therefore wanted everyone to be silent. The thought that this was an ordinary dream immediately disappeared somewhere. He clearly did not sleep, and he saw everything quite clearly, and especially all these clothes and various decorations. It was all exactly the same as in the scene from the game he was playing. It seemed like he had transported himself into this game. It was called the cultivation of immortality dominion over the world. And in that game there was a part where the main character kills Chun Hu-jin. It was very disappointing to be transported into the game to become a villain whom he himself killed not so long ago. What made it even worse was that of all the characters, this was the one he was reborn into. Kuan Tong, who stood with weapons at the ready all this time looking at the crying enemy, made the assumption that he was practicing a devilish spell. One of them said that it seems that their target is not himself and they need to take advantage of this moment in order to eliminate him. But when he got as close as possible to Hu-jin's body, his weapon began to glow with a bright yellow glow. He screamed very loudly and fearfully that this simply couldn't happen and Hu-jin should have been dead a long time ago. This spell was incredibly powerful in power, and Kuan Tong witnessed the guy say that there was no need to bother him when he was in such a deplorable state. It's good that the guy remembered that in this game the most powerful spells are spiritual, since they contain the powers of all things, even the powers of the souls of the dead. It was strange, but just by waving one of his fingers the guy forced this opponent to change his physical shell. Literally a second later streams of blood began to burst out of his back, which from the outside looked like many arrows. This mentor was Lu Shi, and the kinetic energy that his body received was enough for him to fly several meters away and approach his minions. They immediately decided to attack their enemy simultaneously and eliminate him on the spot. But for some reason Hu-jin even liked this, since he was very aware of how strong he was. And the thought is that since he is here he should make a little effort to get rid of these NPCs. Having made several swings of his hand, he struck the ground with his palm and thereby summoned more than 6 ghostly warriors from the underworld. They immediately got down to business and quickly began to strike multiple blows at the students of the Kuan Tong organization. And the guy in turn just stood motionless and ordered the attackers to tell their master to finally calm down. When several more hours had passed, all the subordinates were busy washing away the bloody stains from the expensive stone from which the floor was made here. Everything had to be done as quickly as possible so that the blood would not seal and leave more problematic marks. The parents meanwhile were talking worriedly, mainly about the fact that their son had just killed the followers of the Kuan Tong clan, and this would bring a lot of problems. The mother cried but also understood that their son did this to protect them and protect the teachings of Yu Ling. This was indeed true, but now the most important thing for her was that he was alive. But when the tears dried, my mother asked her husband if he had noticed that Hu-jin had become somehow different after waking up. And indeed the guy really had nothing in common with that person. Before his rebirth he was a real hicka, an ordinary guy who before he could graduate from university died unexpectedly. In the life of this game he was a complete zero in mastering martial arts, a guy always shaking with fear, who before he could get married suddenly died from a sword. The realization of this quickly infuriated the guy, since this game reborn him into this very character which he really did not like. But at some point a girl heard all these screams and said that he shouldn't say such unpleasant things. She suddenly appeared behind him, and then the guy started screaming, accusing the girl of being very scary and suddenly appearing out of nowhere. Then the girl became more aggressive and asked him not to behave the same way towards his own wife every time. But he still did not believe that she was his real wife. In order to calm the situation, the girl said that she is a system, so she will constantly follow the guy on his heels. She also explained that it was the system that transferred him to the game of cultivation of immortality world domination. The villain who has been oppressed, who has gone through fire and water challenges representatives of the 13 clans of the city of Haizhou to a duel. And in the end it all ends in such a way that he becomes the ruler of the city and the most powerful among all those who tried to kill him. It was a truly amazing and inspiring storyline. The girl was so emotional that she even managed to cry. But Hu-jin didn't like all these stories very much, so when he came closer he grabbed the girl right by the face. And then in a quiet voice she asked why he was brought back to life, since this story does not answer such a question. She replied that he had nothing to be interested in, but in short he, as a player who had completed all the levels needed to cooperate with the system to create a new main plot line. Of course, the guy asked what would happen if he refused. It was also strange that there were more hardcore players, and it was strange that they chose him. She replied that he would answer all these questions if you just remember the moment how he got into this game. Suddenly, at that very moment, the guy began to feel those same emotions, and at the same time she told the girls that he had died, and therefore he ended up in the game since he was chosen by her. Saying all this, the girl used her abilities to stop his heart for a few seconds and say that if he does not want to cooperate, then he will be useless for the game. And in this case, he will simply need to wait for his hour of death, which will come as suddenly as the system itself wishes. During this entire story, her face retained a small smile which frightened the guy, instilling in him a feeling of victimhood. Falling out of bed, he said that there couldn't even be any conversations here since he agreed to cooperate. Having made several compliments, he also added that he could not be ungrateful for such a warm welcome. But in his heart, he understood that this girl had achieved her goal, and now his plans were to learn the rules of the game and bend this companion to himself. According to the girl in the case, I won't wait for them today, so they should definitely move forward right now. The first stop was the city of Haizhou, where the guy will have to take part in the competition. In the meantime, the axe moved to Hunan province, and to be more precise, to the house of the Bai family. Inside this house, two girls constantly argued about the fact that Chun, who really rose from the dead and also killed 13 disciples after his return. The younger sister was indignant because she was trying to prove that this was true and this all really happened quite recently. All these screams prompted her to think that this guy must have used some kind of forbidden technique in order to save his body from death. Also, since Shi Daxia went to the competition, Qin, who will not be able to cause trouble. It was just interesting what he would do this time in order to take revenge. The eldest girl immediately ordered Xiao Ro to pack her things since they would also take part in the competition this time. Her name was Bai Shiaoqing, and she told her subordinate that she wanted to see with her own eyes what kind of evil spirit this Chun Hu Jin was. Of course, when leaving, the son told his parents that he was going on a long journey in order to take part in the competition. And he advised the parents themselves to go to the border. Then the father told him that he had been thinking a lot in recent days since, in his opinion, he had been too strict with his son in the past, and wished him good luck in the competition. Since now for them there is nothing more important than the fact that their own son is standing in front of them safe and sound. Hu Jin may have even suffered through hardships in life and died alone, but he had wonderful and truly loving parents. Therefore, the guy promised himself to live a prosperous life for the sake of his parents. He patted his father on the shoulder and said that he need not worry about what the future holds for his son. There was a fire in his eyes when he said that he remembers well that if you don't make an effort you can die or be beaten. Their noble family, which passed on the teachings of Yulin from generation to generation, was founded a century ago, and the guy promised not to push around possessing such great power. He was also confident that he would become the first in the competition and return the former glory to their family. Slapping his father on the shoulder again, he said that he should not worry, as he was no longer going to repeat the mistakes of the past. Now the actions had moved, and the guys were already in a completely different city where new activities awaited him. It was a city called Linu in the central square, of which one could now hear terrible and disgusting sounds. All because right near the entrance to the Landau competition authorities you could now see a guy who became ill right in front of everyone. When the attack ended, he thought that he was very sick in transport, just like before moving into this world. Perhaps he shouldn't have used his powers to create the illusion of a flying car and quickly move to the collection point. But perhaps this is all due to the fact that he simply began to show off in front of his parents, who were surprised that their son could summon a flying car. At some point, when the guy was already feeling better, someone who stood a short distance from his vehicle turned to him and said that the guy's abilities were clearly excellent. Since no one has yet managed to create such a flying car and use it only to move between cities. It quickly became clear that this stranger knew well that Hu Jin was standing in front of him, especially when he said that he expected this from the person who killed the representatives of the 13 clans. This stranger had an eye with a double pupil, which could mean that this old man was clearly an unusual person. But in this situation it was impossible to be aggressive, and so Chun said that that battle made him very famous. A smile appeared on his face, and smiling he asked the old man if he had come here for revenge, but he replied that he would not fight with a child. Instead of a fight, he invited the guy to go forward to participate in the competition and register in the Eastern Room. It was good for the guy that this stranger did not come after his soul, since he was not yet strong enough to solve such unpleasant situations. When the guy and his wife began to go inside, the old man who remained on the street thought that this young man would really become a worthy opponent in the future. Having walked a little forward behind one of the screens, the guy heard a familiar voice asking if Lingchen had already registered. The guy became very interested, and so he came closer in order to better listen and look inside a little. He quickly remembered that this was the name of the main character of the game and also the person who killed Chun Hu-jin. Now it was necessary to find out who was looking for him and for what purposes this person needed such information. It turned out that it was a rather young girl who, thanks to a simple question, was able to obtain information that the hero was in the Fulu Inn. She turned her head to her subordinate and said that they needed to move out and not waste much time in this place. It was also not difficult to notice that her right hand was wrapped in a white snake with which this girl was talking. It was only necessary to look a little, and the guy quickly realized that in front of him was the same girl he was thinking about. Memories of Chun Hu-jin tore through his head in a continuous stream, and now in front of him was the moment when he played with Bai Shiaoqing, his first love. That day he gave her his mother's bracelet and promised that in the future she would become his wife. She was then very pleased that over time she should become the bride of Chun Hu-jin. She was really very beautiful, and because of this the guy was even a little embarrassed when he saw her now in person. Moreover, this even affected the stability of his stance as he tightly grabbed the screen that was in the room. One moment and he tears off this very screen and it falls to the floor, opening a passage. The girl was surprised that this happened and immediately drew attention to the man who stood in front of her. Hu-jin felt very ashamed because he realized that now most likely the girl would find out who he was. And in fact, when Xiaoqing was able to identify the guy, she screamed his name very loudly and the snake on her hand began to hiss. When the guy first noticed her, he instantly realized that she quickly took a fighting stance when she was able to identify him. One of her hands was behind her back as she moved slowly and tried to achieve concentration of chi power in a short period of time. This was difficult to do due to the fact that the enemy who was now in front was not one such. But now she only thought that Hu-jin was a real devil and killing him was the same as interceding for ordinary people. But she could not concentrate her energy due to the fact that she was soft-hearted by nature. From the outside it looked strange, especially when a subordinate ran up to her and also tried to support her morally. The guy meanwhile was wondering if Bai Shiaoqing was really so emotional that she was ready to cry. This was natural since she was Chun Wu-jin's fiancé. Anyone will be shocked to see the groom who has returned from the other world. Therefore now the guy made the decision to just say hello and not panic also without thinking about what to say next. It was necessary not to scare the girl since in this case she might behave unusually and even get angry. But this plan did not work because literally a few moments later the girl again took a fighting stance and screamed her husband's name. She released a rope from her pouch that contained chi energy and spread along its entire length. When the guy grabbed her, he immediately asked the girl what it all meant and why she was behaving this way. Then the girl answered him that there was a real devil in front of her now and that's all it meant. Since it is not difficult to guess that the devil in the flesh will be up to something evil, and this means that he needs to be stopped. Now it became obvious to Jean that the girl wanted to kill him right on the spot from the very beginning. But instead of being angry, he only said that Madame Bai was truly extraordinary, and after such a long separation she didn't even smile. He noticed that it was not very nice when they first met each other and immediately fell into conflict. The girl shouted that it seems that the guy forgot that since the day he used black magic they broke off the engagement and nothing connects them anymore. She also said that you want to crush a monster like Chun Hu into powder right on the spot. After this phrase, the guy loosened his grip and let the girl take back the rope that once carried the internal energy of chi. And then the guy said that now everything is obvious and it is clear to everyone that Jean is in front of the lady. He came closer and said that he wanted to watch the girl grind him into powder when he didn't even resist. At one time the guy missed this girl very much and he missed her for a long time when she was gone. It is also worth understanding that in fact it was Bai Shiaoqing who forgot about the good he did to her. That year the girl's cold was difficult to cure despite the fact that the guy constantly helped and said that he would save her by any effort. To heal her he had to use black magic and pass it through his own body. Then all his friends said that Hu-jin had gone down a slippery slope and should be expelled from the clan altogether. Because of the girl his spiritual power was damaged and became unclean. But when the girl was cured she promised that even if he chose the path of evil she still would not leave him. But now that Chun Hu Jin has experienced his own death, this woman claims that he is a real devil. At the same time thinking about this, the guy grabbed her by the face and without much effort in this way did not let her go anywhere. The girl began to appear and ask what Hu Jin was up to now and what he was doing. But at this moment for the guy there was only one question in his head, as he was thinking about whether all this was really a deception. Xiaoqing absolutely could not understand what was happening now, and why her heart began to beat so wildly. It beat so fast that it seemed ready to jump out of my chest at any second. Therefore, with great effort, she got out of the grip and began to run away in the opposite direction. At some point, she began to fall to the floor, and her subordinate could not understand what happened to her and why she suddenly lost consciousness. Coming closer, Hu Jin caught her body and began to direct the energy into her, which he received by drawing a hieroglyph in the sky with his index finger. For some reason her pulse was unstable and constantly changing. Everything indicated that several of her acupuncture points had been artificially sealed by someone. This could explain that her memories were distorted and someone did it in order to achieve their own goals. The servants who constantly ran after Xiaoqing were generally very loud and constantly shouted at the guy. She did this even at the moment when he paid at the entrance to one of the hotels and asked for one room. The hotel employee said that the guy's room was in the western part on the second floor, and the guy tried to remember this information, not paying attention to the blows from his subordinates on his back. Over time, the guy said that the more the girl makes trouble, the later her mistress will receive help. His voice became more stern and he asked her if she really didn't care about Xiaoqing and if all she could do was make noise. This phrase made her think, and for some time it stood there and did not know what to say to her. She was especially unpleasant when the guy silently began to climb the stairs and began to completely ignore her presence. At some point the system approached Xiao Zhou and said that they needed to take a portion of meat since there was still a lot of work ahead. Well, the subordinate only thought that Hu Jin used to be crazy about his mistress, but now she got sick and she wanted Chun himself to get sick. Meanwhile, the system seemed to teleport to the guy in order to say that he was carrying such a charming girl in his arms. Literally a second after this phrase, Xiao screamed very loudly as she was angry with Hu Jin. Some time passed, and now the doors behind which the two were located were closed, preventing anyone from going inside. Xiao stood right under these doors and said that she was giving him a warning since their mistress is of aristocratic origin. He cannot do whatever comes into his head with her. At some point the guy said that he was surprised that something was standing under the doors and kept listening to what was happening there. Then the girl screamed very loudly as she was surprised by such wording on the part of Hu Jin. But he only ordered her to be silent, and it was better to think about the condition of her mistress and not just scream. He also didn't like the fact that this girl constantly made mountains out of molehills and created problems out of the blue. Meanwhile, the head of the Bai family named Bai Mayan was standing outside, and he heard that his subordinate wanted him to pay attention to his jasper pendant. The light that this pendant emitted only meant that the sister was somewhere nearby and was getting closer. Then the subordinate said that if we analyze the situation around us, we can conclude that she may have stayed at this hotel. The head said that they should check everything since this pendant cannot be wrong. Meanwhile, the screams in the corridor clearly did not become quieter, but rather became more sincere and plentiful with every second. She could not come to terms with the fact that she had absolutely no idea what was happening behind those doors. At some point, the girl heard a conversation behind other doors that the guest they were looking for was staying in a room right at the end of the corridor. A few moments later, the guards opened the door to the room with their key and said that they were glad that they had found Xiaoqing. But when they saw what was happening inside, they were immobilized for several seconds from surprise and embarrassment. Bai Shiaoqing's body was slightly exposed in several places, and she made very strange sounds. It was difficult for all of them to believe that this was actually happening, and so they simply watched with open eyes. Everything reached its peak when the girl with the last of her strength told the guy to take it easy as she couldn't stand it anymore. It was then that the guards came to their senses, since this was already as strange as possible. They immediately grabbed their weapons and began to move closer and closer to the guy who was now sitting as close to the lady as possible. Approaching, they ordered their sister to be released immediately and to surrender voluntarily. One of them even swung his sword and already pointed its sharp blade directly at Hu Jin's head. But at the very last moment, an explosion occurred at the place where the tip of the sword was, which threw the owner back a little. Then the subordinate asked why the master did not allow him to finish off Jin, and he only said that he saw a disgrace in front of him. There was a short pause, after which the master said that it looks like this guard is blind, because now it is very clear that he just almost interrupted the treatment of his own sister. Despite what was said above, I watched with great surprise what was happening, and could not explain it to myself. There were many questions in his head, but the biggest one was how Jin could return from the other world. It was also not clear how after his resurrection he was able to master such incredible power. A power that can heal people in a short time. The master clearly saw how large the healing aura was emanating from the guy. The energy that spread right around the back of the girl's head acquired an increasingly lighter character and took on the appearance of a hieroglyph. At some point, the girl felt a very obvious warmth that enveloped her body from all sides. It was like a large and warm hand was stroking her body and giving her comfort. All this went on for some time, and the girl found out that perhaps she had died, and this is what her heaven looks like. Well, this couldn't go on forever, since at some point Xiaoqing's voice ordered him to kill the targets without regret. This voice became louder and louder, and it constantly ordered to kill Jin as soon as possible. The girl began to understand that she should have hated him, but for some reason now she felt how lonely he was. A moment later her body began to emit green energy, which was similar to the one that had recently been near the back of her head. This feeling was incredibly familiar, and it constantly became more vivid and obvious. The person she saw before her eyes now looked like the real one, the real Hu Jin. And it was at that moment that memories that she had completely forgotten not so long ago began to flow into her head. She clearly remembered the moment when Hu Jin climbed onto a stump and said that he could not kidnap such a sweet girl, but she need not worry because he would not let her be offended. She also remembered when he gave her a bracelet and his mother, which meant that she was now his bride. Remembering all this, tears began to well up in her eyes, because now she understood which memories are actually real. And even that moment when his bloody body lay on the floor and asked not to forget him once again confirmed that she was Hu Jin's bride. All I wanted now was for him to forgive her and allow her to move on without feeling guilty. Now she was crying bitterly because she understood that she needed to apologize to Hu Jin for daring to forget him. These emotions incredibly quickly and incredibly effectively eclipsed her reason, and it seemed to her that Hu Jin was now in front of her and she could even touch him. But over time it turned out that she ran up to her grandfather and due to visions and hallucinations confused him with Chun. Because this just happened, the mistress immediately became sad and depressed, and her subordinate tried to help her come to her senses. She cried non-stop and said that it was not her fault, and in fact she did not want everything to happen this way. The lady's subordinate at that moment was glad that Xiaoqing was still able to come to her senses, and this could not but make them happy. At some point the crying became less abundant, and then the mistress decided to turn to her girlfriend. She said that she had just dreamed of Hu Jin. It was difficult for her to look into her grandfather's eyes at that moment, but she still decided to explain the whole situation. Grandfather withdrew his gaze when she said that she thought that Hu Jin was a monster, but in fact this was not the case, and her memories were somehow distorted. Behind the grandfather, while he was thinking at that moment, Hu Jin appeared and said that she only banned the man for life, but now everything is in order since he is in front of her. Xiaoqing was incredibly surprised when she saw his face and realized that the memory of him being alive was actually true. The guy said that it was him, and now he will always be here and will not die for a long time. The girl immediately hugged him and asked for 1,000 readings for her attitude towards him. The guy only had to explain that he did not blame her in any way. Hu Jin was so focused on the treatment that he didn't even notice how wonderful she smelled, and for some reason this smell was already familiar to him. He even thought that the real Hu Jin would not be able to enjoy this, so it was better for him to do it. Grandfather watched everything that was happening from the side, and he had several thoughts on this matter since in general he was a rather wise man. So after a few seconds he made a decision and decided to make it a reality. He turned towards the guy and said that they should go out to discuss something. At the same time one could see on the grandfather's face that he was serious, and clearly exit from this room would not be limited to ordinary dialogue. But still, when leaving, the guy asked the girl not to worry because they would just chat a little about everything. He began to get closer and closer to the exit and slowed down slightly when he noticed something very strange. Namely, this oddity was the amount and concentration of energy in the grandfather's hand when he walked around the corner. This seemed strange to him, but Hu Jin had no other choice. I had to go after my grandfather. It was necessary to walk a short distance, and a pair of two warriors already found themselves in a suburban forest. They stood at a distance from each other and were simply silent for a while, looking into each other's eyes. Because of such an awkward pause, the guy decided to tell his grandfather that he had brought him to the forest. Well, he still didn't say why, and Huene himself still had no idea. But when he said this, the guy was only thinking that this old man was just showing off thanks to his status. After some time, grandfather said that in order to understand what would happen next, he initially wanted to ask the guy if he knew what this place was. This place was nothing more than a cemetery in which a lot of people were already buried. Further, grandfather said that the competition that will take place is the fairest competition in the world. Unfortunately, not all participants follow the rules during the battle, and this happens quite often. Sooner or later, hypocritical people appear who cannot fight fairly and therefore help themselves with the help of various tricks. It is in this forest that they get rid of their opponents, and indeed, if you look around, you could see a lot of mutilated bodies. According to the grandfather, such people never felt shame or remorse for their actions. He also believed that today, on this important day, in order to save his granddaughter, he would have to become a similar villain. In parallel with this, he began to use his family's technique and said that since Huene returned from the other world, he asks to show him, the old man, what he is capable of. Because if he shows a decent level of mastery of martial arts, he will receive a blessing from the grandfather and will be able to continue to stay with Xiaoqing. At this very moment, a huge wave of water that was saturated with energy began to move in space and approach the guy. For now, he thought that what was in front of him now was the forgotten teaching of the Bai family called the Great Mirror Lake. During the times when Chun was wooing Xiaoqing, he often resorted to this trick to beat him up, and this always terrified the guy. But now everything has changed, since whoever Huene is now is a completely different person. Just one movement of the finger was enough for a hieroglyph to appear in the air above him, emitting energy. At that moment, a skull appeared right above the guy's head, from which various hieroglyphs flowed and were painted in bloody colors. The guy told his sparring partner that if this fight was already difficult, he would try to show what he could do. Then he moved his hand, and all this technique that he created behind his back and above his head began to attack. The grandfather was surprised that this was happening and could not believe his eyes for some time. The two strongest energies were spent in battle in the forest, which was a cemetery for many who came here for a duel. This fight was clearly visible from the city, and many noticed that the blue technique was similar to the spiritual power of the Bai family, while the red power was unknown to them, and they could not even understand what its source was and who this mighty warrior was. Through the crowd, which was watching what was happening from a distance, suddenly someone tried to break forward, and it looked like it was a girl. It turned out that it was Xiaoqing, who wanted to get as close as possible to the battle site, and her subordinate could not keep up. While driving, the girl only thought that grandfather and Huene had disappeared for a moment, and she hoped that nothing bad happened there. Meanwhile, the action moved to the battle site, and there it was possible to notice that red energy was spreading not only towards the grandfather but also in different directions. This very energy was able to cut the space around itself, and like a thin blade even cut off a small piece of grandfather's hair. At that moment, he thought that he had not seen such incredible supernatural power for a long time. It was unexpected. It was very difficult to get used to the fact that the same villainous loser, Huene, was still in front of him. Although the appearance was still the same, his views and manner were completely different. Not wanting to wait, the head of the Bai family immediately shouted and began to ask Huene where he got the strength that he never had. But the guy didn't even have time to answer when grandfather got distracted by someone's voice that was heard from behind him. A girl ran out to the place of the fight and confidently stated that she would not allow him to treat Huene like that. After this sentence, there was no response from grandfather, and so Xiaoqing simply stood unshaken. The guards had already run up to the scene and forced the young lady to wear the clothes in which she usually slept. The guy knew well how to behave in such situations, so with one wave of his hand, he threw off the outer cape that he had been wearing while moving along the street. In just a moment, he came closer to the girl and threw this robe on her, at the same time saying that he hoped that Xiaoqing would not catch a cold. Despite the fact that the guy was silent, he showed with all his appearance that Bai Shiaoqing is now his wife, and he cannot allow others to see her like this. Grandfather was not entirely comfortable watching this, but he understood that now was the only moment when he would be able to explain everything. Therefore, he turned towards the guy and said that after everything that had happened, it is obvious that nothing could separate the two of them. Xiaoqing also had something to say, so turning to her grandfather, she also prepared to reproach him a little. She said that Hu Jin was still a beginner, and even though Grandpa's skill level was much higher, he still used the Great Mirror Lake technique. It was very unpleasant to hear this, and so Muyang asked his granddaughter to stop grumbling and listen to what he had to say. He explained that her husband out of nowhere learned an incredible technique that even the master could not master. But the guy said that there was no need to exaggerate since it was obvious that grandfather Bai simply lost to him in the duel. This managed to melt the grandfather's heart a little since such politeness can impress a lot of people. Now it was necessary to explain the whole situation, and the grandfather said that while the guy was being pursued by the clans for the purpose of murder, he himself remained on the sidelines because of the Xiaoqing. But after the death of the guy, he was afraid that the girl would be very worried about the Chersi, and therefore, with the help of spiritual power, he blocked her memories. And today, Hu Jin manually removed the block from her memories, which means this is God's will. He also asked the guy to put his hands forward because he wanted to give him something very important, something that their family had put a lot of effort into keeping it a secret. He was going to give him their family equipment called the Great Mirror Sea, so that this would be compensation for the fact that his grandfather was on the sidelines when that madness happened. Hu Jin's body contains strong spiritual power, but it was slightly chaotic. But if a guy trains, then he will be able to reach incredible heights and achieve a lot of things. But to do this, you need to learn how to direct the energy inside your body in the right direction, and thanks to this, increase the level of your skills. And only then will the guy be able to achieve perfection and become the best once and for all. While this technique was being passed on, my grandfather noticed that the guy was really talented and had a lot ahead of him. It was quite unexpected that at that very moment another girl would appear behind Hu Jin's back and say that for this reason she liked him. All because he is the only one who deserves to be the best player and build a new plot line. The guy quickly realized that it would be difficult to explain where this girl came from and why she was so close to him. Hu Jin had already begun to strain his brain to come up with an excuse, but looking at Xiaoqing's dissatisfied face, he could not put together two words. But she said that she should have guessed about this earlier, since in fact she is not blind and already understands everything. Especially looking at this woman, she also added that even a blind person would probably be able to understand what was really going on here. At that moment, the surprise on Hu Jin's face was very clearly visible, as was the emotion that he was incredibly surprised that he had lost what he had gained so quickly. The young lady said that she looked like that in front of her now was the very person who saved him and pulled him out of that world. This option was incredibly strange and surprising, and the woman didn't even know what she would answer. She was completely confused when the young mistress ran up and said that she noticed that she appeared thanks to her unknown technique. Of course, Xiaoqing didn't know that this was because this woman was the system itself. The lady's assistant also noted that she is very naive if she thinks that this is a savior and not her love rival. But Xiaoqing told her that this was impossible because Hu Jin always liked young girls like herself. And after this phrase, the system became very angry since it clearly did not take these words to its advantage. She started shouting that she created 3,000 textures and tried on 5,000 models, and now she hears that she is also an old woman. Grandfather was already incredibly uncomfortable watching these strange dialogues from the sidelines, and so he asked everyone to stop immediately. All because it is very indecent to have a fight now after what happened, since if they were not busy with useless arguments, they would clearly have noticed that something had changed around them. Namely, if you look closely, you could notice that other people had arrived in this forest and were getting closer and closer. When they were already close enough, one of them said that in front of them was the Bai family. They stopped and looked at each other for a while the leader of the organization thought about how to start their dialogue. This leader was none other than Tunglong, who was a member of the Beast Master clan. And he said sarcastically that he did not expect to see a familiar face in this forest. Grandfather quickly realized that these were people from the clan of Beast Lords, and he warned them that this forest was the first place to avoid ahead of the competition. He replied that he did not know that only an old man of principle could visit this forest, but everyone else could not. The security was outraged by this attitude towards their leader, and one of them even said how he even dared to provoke their master in such a way. But the grandfather calmed them down and said that he had already participated in the Lantau competition many years ago, and even took the title of champion. And in principle he added that there was no need for him to start an argument with such a child as their group. But in response, Wang only laughed, since now there were much more of them than the members of the Bai family. He noticed that the mentor was Bai and a direct authority, but it's a pity that when the clans dealt with Hu Jin, the Bai clan played a significant significant role in this, since in fact they hiding their own motives sat on the sidelines. At this time from behind the grandfather someone's voice was heard asking Tunglong when Chun was hiding at that time. In his opinion, it was Van who gave away his location. This information was confidential, and so Van was very surprised when he realized that someone knew about it. Then the guy looked out completely and said that Van had become the successor of a famous clan, and therefore it seems that now he doesn't even want to say hello to his old acquaintance. All the members of the Beast Master clan were surprised that Hu Jin was now alive in front of them. The guy noticed that this was absolutely true and slowly stood up and walked closer and closer to their group. He added that at that time Van was just a weed and was so pitiful compared to Chun, who came from a noble clan, that he allowed him to become a personal subordinate. But the guy did not expect that he would give up his location in exchange for the title in terms of Beast Lords. This was indeed true, and one of Wang's subordinates whispered to him that he should not get involved in the conflict, since according to rumors Chun, having returned from the other world, killed the senior students of several clans. This subordinate also added that today they agreed to meet with the Waning Moon clan for negotiations, and therefore there is no need to start a showdown. Taking all this into account, Van ordered them all to stop since he had other important things to do, and they did not have time to argue. But when he left, he told the guy that he wouldn't take his eyes off him at the Lantau competition. He also noted that meeting a dead person in the morning is clearly not good, and they should not fight at such an early time. But as they were leaving, Hu Jin suddenly noticed something that made him immediately scream. He ordered Van to stop where he was standing now and explained something that interested the guy now. Tunglong turned his body and asked the guy what he was up to and how he dared to stop them. The guy really had reasons to suspect this man since he was interested in the green bell on his belt. Even Van himself initially did not understand why he noticed this item on his belt, since it was completely unremarkable. But Hu Jin's face radiated rage, especially when he asked the man where this item came from. Van actually strained himself a lot trying to remember what it was and why the guy was so angry when he talked about it. Even Xiaoqing, who stood aside almost all the time, asked the guy why he had the bell of King Chijiao's older sister and what happened to her if he had it. After he found out the reason, a barely noticeable smile appeared as he realized that the danger had already passed. Van explained that he had her favorite thing and therefore the others should guess what he did with it to get it. Hu Jin was already angry enough to begin to extract energy from his body, and also a mysterious thunder spark. Undoubtedly, this could have a very big impression on the group and scared Wang. The guy said that they managed to piss him off despite the fact that he had already practically set them free. Sparks around his body became an increasingly common occurrence, and all the group could do was watch from the sidelines. The guy had personal reasons for feeling such anger towards that girl. None of the outsiders knew it, but in fact elder sister Ching Xiao was his favorite character. The red energy became increasingly brighter and more noticeable, and the level of intensity in the group increased exponentially. Van Stahl became more confident in her abilities and asked her subordinate why they should be afraid of this sucker. But he said that the spiritual power of their enemy was too great, and in fact it was worth fearing now. The grandfather, who was watching everything that was happening, realized that if this child caused harm to anyone, he would obviously be disqualified from the competition. Knowing the only one who could influence what was happening, he asked Xiaoqing to talk some sense into the guy, since it was impossible for him to come into conflict with Tunglong. The girl thought a little, as she was not ready to blindly follow the orders that her grandfather gave her. After a few seconds, she said that she would not do this since she knew from the very beginning that this kind of competition was absolutely pointless. Taking first place by force is not a very important matter, and such competitions should not be supported by clans at all. Therefore, the girl adopted a different tactic and simply continued to stand in place and admire the incredibleness and coolness of her husband's technique. Grandfather could not influence how Hu Jin would behave, so he simply continued to ignore all this. Analyzing everything around, he noticed incredibly strong gusts of wind, which were constantly intensifying and indicated an increase in strength. He hoped that, before a full-blown fight broke out, the man would be able to stop it. Wang also used a fairly strong technique and drew several hieroglyphs in the air, thereby summoning most of all the forces he had. He had wanted this battle to happen for a long time, and it seemed like now was a good time to carry it out. He tried to sound confident, but in reality he was a little scared due to the fact that he now saw with his own eyes how strong his opponent was. Even his high-level spell would not be able to stop Hu Jin's advance if he put a lot of energy into it. The guy noticed that to strengthen his defense, he resorted to a spiritual spell with an expanded meaning. But now he didn't even want to pay attention to it since he knew how to perform a very good attack at the technical level. In total, he drew a few hieroglyphs, and one that looked vaguely like a dragon appeared right above his head. And Wang, who saw this, could not believe his own eyes since the Hu Jin he knew before clearly could not do this. The guy had absolute strength, and with a movement of one hand, he sent a large stream of energy directly towards his enemy. And this red dragon began to fly at a very high speed into the spiritual fortification of Tunglong. He was a little scared but still understood that now a lot would depend on how effectively he made the defense. Therefore the man directed most of his internal energy forward in order to make the gate that was in front of his body more powerful. And indeed they remained glowing much brighter, which meant that the technique was greatly enhanced. But when the dragon flew close enough, its energy was enough to destroy the defense in the blink of an eye. Wang, it took a lot of effort to ensure that all this energy that would rush through his body would not kill him now. But at some point energy appeared on the horizon which in its color and strength was clearly different from the one that Van had. It was the same dragon which also radiated energy but was lighter and rather blue in color. These two dragons engaged in battle and destroyed each other due to the large amount of energy they transferred into the body. A voice from the side said that this technique was quite skillful and clearly very powerful and incredible. Flying closer, the unknown man said that in front of him was clearly a famous hero from the past. When this character landed on the ground, the same energy from which the dragon was made was coursing around him. This man was the seventh elder of the Green Wave clan named Haolian Lianshan. Hu Jin, although vaguely I still remember who he is and clearly knew what he was doing. Coming closer, the grandfather said that it was good that they met again since quite a long time had passed. But it seemed that there was someone else here who knew him because after a while a hoarse voice shouted the name Haolian Lianshan. It was grandfather, and his face did not radiate any emotion when he said all this. Haoyan too just looked into his eyes, and it looked as if they were enemies and now because of old grievances. Grandfather swung his hand and it flew at high speed straight towards the man who stood opposite. But in fact he just hit him on the shoulder, and they still looked at each other seriously for a few more seconds. But after that they laughed very loudly, and now everything looked as if they had been friends since they were 5 years old. Everyone else watched this from the side, and even Hu Jin himself did not understand what was happening here. Meanwhile, the group continued to move towards where the competition was supposed to take place, and the two grandfathers communicated with each other. Bai said that dragging the elder of the Green Wave clan into a bar is more difficult than bringing an entire clan into order. And he answered that the Bai himself sits at home for days on end and does not go anywhere. While moving in parallel, the guy asked his wife if her grandfather really knew this old man. In her opinion, the grandfather actually had many old acquaintances. But the dialogue between the two grandfathers continued, and Bai Mayan invited the two of them to have a drink as soon as they arrived in the city. They were silent for a while, and after this pause Mayan told his friend that he was still the same and clearly did not age in soul. He meant that the elder of the Green Wave clan would not interrupt their fight that was taking place in the forest. Perhaps the old man was purposefully looking for them in order to practice, or because he was bored. But Haoyan just laughed and said that his friend praised him greatly. They had been rivals for half their lives, and during that time he had become tired of fighting and killing, and now he was no longer interested. This time he became one of the leaders of the Landau competition, and at one point someone reported that there was a fight going on in the forest, and so he came with you to watch. For the guy, meanwhile, it was very unpleasant and strange to hear that someone reported what was happening in the forest. When his wife asked why he was so worried, he replied that it seemed strange to him that since ancient times people who entered into conflict before competitions had problems. No matter who the instigator was, they were either eliminated or they died, thereby leaving the competition. The more people eliminated, the more chances others have to advance in the competition, and quite a lot of people die this way. But the guy got into a fight and they were reported before anyone was hurt. On the contrary, the incident was even hushed up. Hu Jin decided to approach Haolian's grandfather in order to ask who was such a generous person who decided to help them resolve the dispute. By that time they had already reached the gate to the city, and an unfamiliar voice said that it seemed that young Master Chun was overpraising him a little, since in fact all this was not difficult for him, and on the contrary he was happy to help. Now in front of the shooting stood another young man who had a blindfold over his eyes, and who said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Now the guy needed his whole brain on the beach to remember what kind of character he was, what his role was, and what his name was, but he couldn't do it, so he asked the stranger who he actually was. In response, he laughed and noticed that it seems that the higher the rank, the worse Hu Jin's memory. He introduced himself and said that he was a chronicler of the Waning Moon clan named Mutan Tanju. Grandfather was familiar with this phrase since he had heard about this clan more than once. The guy in turn remembered that in the past, when all the clans went against Chun Hu Jin, it was the Waning Moon clan that was ahead of everyone. But now for the guy, this man was the most ordinary stranger, and accordingly he did not know what to do with him and what to talk about. The old man became bored because there were no dialogues taking place, so he even yawned while looking at all this. A second later, he announced to everyone that everything was settled and good, which means that in 2 days the competition will be held, and everyone needs to gain strength and prepare for this. Newton noted that he was only worried about the safety of the group, and since everything was in order, he was forced to go. For grandfather, even this seemed strange, since it was unexpected that there were such fair people in the Waning Moon clan. Tangzhu began to leave, and Muyang just smiled, trying not to respond in any way to the proposal that he had just voiced. The guy joked with a very familiar feeling which told him that he had already seen this guy somewhere and should know him better. He asked the system what connects his character and Mutan and why he doesn't remember him. But she replied that she couldn't stand him since he was modeled better than her. Moreover, I didn't want to answer this question so as not to spoil the guy what would happen next. Wang made a bow and thanked all the elders for the help they provided in resolving the conflict. He also added that the clan of the Lord and the beasts was leaving in order to gain more strength. But when he had almost disappeared from the horizon, Hu Jin ordered them to stop at the place where they were standing. Tunglong even managed to tense up a second time and ask his interlocutor what he had suddenly thought of. The guy approached Haoyang and bowed and said that he had come into conflict with the clan of beast lords because their sister Ching Xiao had disappeared many days ago. However, today, while moving through the forest, he noticed that her golden bell was on the Tunglong belt. Therefore, he wanted to ask the elder and do the right thing so that he would not blackmail the guy by taking advantage of the situation, otherwise he would not be able to concentrate on the fights. All he wanted was to ask the elder of the Green Wave clan to go with him to the place where the Beast Master clan was staying to find out where Ching Xiao was. Of course, they agreed to this and very quickly began to move to the place where the members of the Beast Lords clan were based. The mentor was getting closer and closer, and for this reason the guards let everyone who was behind him through. To simplify everything, Haolian Li decided to turn to Wang and say that if he decided to participate in the competition, he must understand that the conflict does not benefit his good position. He only answered that everyone around them says that Ching Xiao is here. Well, the only problem is that this is impossible. Turning to the guy, he said that he was accusing him only because of this bell which he simply picked up on the way here. Haolian Lianshan began to get tired of this situation, and he said that for that matter, in order to judge everything fairly, he should let them go to the permanent courtyard and inspect everything there. He told him that they could go inside and inspect everything, but he also had conditions for this to happen. Namely, he wanted Hu Jin to kneel down and call Wang Master in case they didn't find anything there. But the guy agreed to this because he believed that he would not be able to enjoy it because it would never happen. He said that if the two parties agree to the conditions, then they go inside to inspect everything. While inside, Hu Jin told his wife to go to the east wing while he went to the west and took a good look at everything there. But Tunglong, who stood behind them and was thinking about his own things, now only thought that they couldn't even imagine how well he had designed everything. Namely, he was pleased with the thought that no one would even suspect the place in which he actually hid this girl. And indeed, behind one of the secret doors was Ching Xiao. From time to time, her stomach growled very loudly due to the fact that she had not eaten any food for a very long time. She wanted to eat constantly, but no one brought her food, so that she would feel as bad as possible. At some point, the girl heard some steps near the only door that led to the room in which it was closed. She heard the sound from time to time, and despite the fact that it all ended the same way every time, you could see a drop of hope in her eyes. This time a man also entered the room and with a smile on his face asked the girl if she had changed her mind yet. He also reminded her that as soon as she agreed to their boss's conditions, he would immediately give her something to eat. In order to psychologically influence her, this man had in his hands a full plate of rice and a few more pieces of cooked fish. With trembling hands, the girl picked up the knife, which was the only item she could find in this empty room. And she ordered the man in a loud voice not to approach because one more step and she would cut her throat on the spot. Of course, the man didn't like the way everything was happening now, and because of this he was angry, So he threw the bowl of food on the floor and started screaming, asking how long the stupid girl was going to clean up. He immediately turned around and began to leave, shouting that sooner or later she would be so hungry that she would agree to the terms. Right near the entrance to this room, there was another man who asked his brother why he was creating so many problems when the situation was already difficult. But he said this because he had a plan, which was that maybe they should use poison on this girl. But he replied that they had already tried this for a long time and this method did not help them at all. It's all because that girl is studying wood healing techniques and her strength is incredible. No poison can harm her, otherwise they would have closed the issue long ago. Now all they could do was wait for the moment when she was so hungry that she was spending all her strength and agree to the conditions. For a man who had just been in her room, watching a girl in such a state was pure pleasure. But if you moved to King Xiao, you could even see from the outside how desperate she was. She constantly said in her head that under no circumstances should she submit to what was happening here. And especially there is no way to submit to the scoundrel who betrayed Hu Jin. It was important to her. Meanwhile, the action moved again, and the wife approached her husband to say that they had already searched everything. But even after a long time of searching, they still could not find anything suspicious, and especially not find Ching Xiao. Hu Jin didn't understand how this was even possible, as he clearly felt the girl's faint breathing through the bell. And this bell still hung on Tunglong's belt and still radiated that same energy. The guy felt very unpleasant when his opponent began to slowly approach him from behind and say that it looked like they had already searched everything. And this only means that it's time for the guy to kneel down and call Wang Tunglong his master. By that time, a very large number of people passing by had already gathered near the place where Hu Jin and Wang Tunglong were talking to each other. They constantly talked among themselves about how it looked like two great warriors, and even a member of the Beast Master clan had gathered here. There was a short pause during which Tunglong said that Chun should have heard such a saying, which sounds like this: "Do you like to play, know how to pay?" He constantly reminded the guy that he was obliged to keep his word. Van really couldn't wait for the moment when the guy would disgrace himself in front of so many people. Hu Jin said that since there is no other way out, he should still say something else and then begin to fulfill his part of the agreement. However, he noticed that that green bell is an item that belongs to their clan, and it must be returned to its rightful owner. Halian, who was standing aside, also told Mr. Wang that since the missing person of the Spirit Lord clan had nothing to do with him, he asked him to return the lost thing to Hu Jin. Tunglong didn't like this whole situation very much, but he was still obliged to give this item back and not ask unnecessary questions. The guy once again made sure that he was right, especially in the fact that the closer the bell is to Ching Xiao, the stronger he reacts and the more energy he pushes out of himself. And the amount of energy that could now be seen emanating from him suggested that the girl was definitely somewhere nearby. Van used the situation so that it was as beneficial as possible for him and added that the guy was chickening out and was stalling for time. But Chun only replied that Tunglong was even more insignificant than one could imagine. Therefore, he decided to ask him again if he really kidnapped Ching Xiao. The level of tension became even greater. Obviously, Tunglong does not understand what consequences a lie can lead to, but he began to suspect something when Jin told him that apparently he did not intend to confess. He immediately began to use one of his techniques, and it quickly became clear that it was somehow connected with the talisman that was now in his hands. The guy even added that initially he didn't want to complicate things, but now he's finally changed his mind. He decided to show other people Wang's true disgusting insides. To do this, it was necessary to send even more energy so that it would penetrate inside the talisman and thereby help the guy in solving this problem. The flow of this energy was visible from afar, but the very appearance of this flow surprised even ordinary passers-by. They talked about how this is a mysterious technique, and in general it is similar to the art of spiritual search. To see such equipment at least once in one's life was considered a great success. The system, which watched everything that happened silently, thought that it had truly chosen the best player who would use his skills like no one else. One of the passers-by who stood closest to the flow of energy screamed when he saw that some of the rays were taking the form of some object. A few moments later, the spiritual power showed the event that happened here not long ago. Now everything is very good. We saw Wang Tunglong carrying a girl in a special cage on wheels and handing her a small bowl of water he ordered her to drink, because he doesn't want to marry a man who is in such a deplorable state. but she responded by ordering him not to approach or she would commit suicide. Van did not like this situation at all, and from his appearance one could tell that he was angry because everything was not going according to his plan. Therefore his eyes began to glow red, and he told the girl that if she thinks she can do it with a dull knife, then it's better to let her try a few more times. Since a short amount of time would pass, and when she was exhausted the man promised to show her what kind of condition it is when a person wants to die more than continue to live. At that same second, he threw a bowl of water directly at King Zano and the cart continued moving along the road. The girl sat on the floor and looked shyly at Wang Telong, although in fact this look could be described in different ways from the outside. This situation made Wang laugh, and he even shouted to his subordinates that she should not be shy since everything would change after the wedding night. The action moved to the present day when Tunglong observed himself and constantly ordered Jean to stop this show. He was incredibly ashamed, and at the same time he understood that such a scandal could lead to his disqualification. The passers-by gradually began to disperse and say that once this man was part of the clan of Lords of the Curled Spirits and in the end betrayed Qin. Now his authority was below the lowest level and he understood it well. Things got even worse when Hu Jin turned to him and said that it is obvious that things are now in such a way that he may no longer fulfill his part of the agreement. He looked straight into his eyes and ordered to release Ching Xiao immediately since he knows that she is somewhere nearby. The man gave an order to one of his subordinates and in a trembling voice ordered him to open the secret door and pull the girl out of there. Now the group proceeded to the room where the girl was and a small explosion occurred near the door. Hu Jin entered the room with a confident expression on his face and walking deeper into the room he told Ching Xiao that he had arrived. But at that moment he did not yet know that the main room was further away. In the history of the room conversations were heard that the girl had finally lost her strength. It turned out that the man who was responsible for Ching Xiao's food was there, and he decided to take advantage of her helpless state at that moment. It didn't take much time for the guy to cover the distance to this man, and using one of the techniques to strike him with his hand. The blow was so energetically strong that his body flew several meters away and hit the wall. Then he fell to the ground and another subordinate who was standing nearby realized that he was unlikely to ever get up. Hu Jin looked at his lifeless body and clearly understood what he had just done would lead to. The second subordinate was very surprised and was in incredible shock when this happened, and as a tactic he chose to simply sit back and not move at all. The guy came closer to the girl and picked her up at the same time noticing that she had almost completely lost consciousness due to hunger. With the last of her strength Ching Xiao said that she was glad that Chun Hu Jin had finally found her and savior. At that moment almost everyone on the street burst into the room and especially Van. He was incredibly dissatisfied and angry that Chun had just arbitrarily killed his subordinate and it seemed incredibly dishonorable. The guy knew what to answer to this because he understood that in this situation absolutely everyone would be on his side. Therefore he said that Wang, this is clearly not the person who should open his mouth about this. He also explained that he killed this man because he had offended the Spirit Lord clan, but in fact in his opinion even death would not be enough. Since according to the rules it is forbidden to kill participants before the competition, the guy promised that Tunglong would not do anything now. But it was also necessary to warn that once the competition began Wang would obviously be in trouble. It didn't seem like the man was scared because of these words, rather his mind and body were completely overwhelmed by anger. His fist came with incredibly great force and it seemed that the shaking of this limb could be heard throughout the entire room. Literally several hours passed and Tunglong was sitting in his office and threw the kettle with all his might on the floor and at the same time said something to his interlocutor. He asked that man where his master was and why he had not yet come to see Tunglong. He explained that Mr. Wang was incredibly angry now and it was unlikely that any constructive dialogue would come out of this. The man was angry and Mutan suggested that this happened because the room was not cool enough. This phrase clearly failed to lower the level of anger in Wang's body, since after all this he said that the Waning Moon clan was not concerned with everything that was happening at all. Because first they threatened him and then forced him to give up Hu Jin's location and promised that they could quickly get rid of him. And now it all turned out that this man unexpectedly resurrected, although the Waning Moon clan claimed that he died once and she always died. Tanch had no answer to this since he had no explanation. In the end, the one who dealt with him was the great Lin Chen. Therefore, if anyone should be blamed for this exchange, then only this person whom no one has the health to blame. Mouton took a few more steps around the room and told his interlocutor that he need not worry since their leader had recently said something. Namely, he notified many that since the clan of the Lord and the Beasts was already connected with the Waning Moon clan, they would not leave them under any circumstances. Since it was the Waning Moon clan that had just resolved the conflict in the abandoned forest and thereby saved Wang Tunglong. These words made sense, and even for such a simple person as Wang everything was clear. His interlocutor advised him to think only about competitions and nothing else. Of course he said all this in order to convince the man that their clan like himself would never leave Hujin alone. The action shifted again, and now everything took place in the room where Chan Hujin was supposed to be during the competition. Xiaoqing did everything her husband told her, and put a compress on Ching Xiao's head, so that the temperature suddenly dropped and she felt better. You could see from the guy's face that he was very worried, because you understand that now this girl is clearly not in the best condition. Well, Hujin still had enough sense to tell his wife that he did not worry as long as Ching Xiao was being watched by his wife. While he was saying this, a very loud scream could be heard outside the window, repeating the same phrase over and over again. This voice also shouted that he was warning everyone, since the power of 10,000 evil spirits that he possesses could lead to disaster if he used it. This voice, and it is obvious that the source of this voice itself poses a certain danger to Chan Hujin. At the same time, one of the subordinates from the clan of Spirit Lords entered the room and asked the guy how he knew that strange girl. It was she who was the source of the voice, and it was she who bore the title of the one who controls 10,000 spirits and in whose blood the blood of gods and demons is mixed. At the same time, passing by, Hujin told this subordinate not to talk nonsense, since this girl is the manager of the house of the clan of Spirit Lords. Going downstairs, the guy found a girl who approached every passerby in this tavern and asked where Jean was. And at some point behind her, she heard a familiar voice that said that he had not seen Cincy for many years and winters. Then Chu Qingxi turned her body completely, and with her whole appearance made it known that she was very happy to see Hujin. She was so happy that as soon as she saw Hujin, she immediately began to run in his direction and shout that she knew that he was not dead. In her opinion, this was not surprising, since he is the young master of the clan of Spirit Lords and much stronger than her, in whose veins flows the blood of gods and demons. But the guy ignored all these words and only said that he was surprised that the girl found out that he was taking part in the Landau competition. She replied that his parents explained everything to her, and when she left the clan to improve her powers, she could not imagine that in 6 months such a catastrophe would overtake their clan. But now that it was all over, it was an even bigger problem for her, since now it was time to strike back. She really hated Linchin, who was the main character of that game, and emphasized that he would take part in the competition and would clearly be a worthy opponent. Meanwhile, the girl who had recently been in Hu Jin's spa regained consciousness, but already lying on the bed in the guy's room. Consciousness was still slightly vague, and looking around she still could not understand where she was. When her vision became more or less adequate, she saw that everything around her looked like a room in some kind of tavern. And this scared her a little, since she didn't remember at all how she got here in the first place. But unfortunately, the memories of what happened to her before the rescue were still in her head, and incredibly traumatized her state of mind. Best of all, she remembered the moment when she dropped the knife from her hands, and this signaled that there was practically no strength left in her body. With the last of her strength, she said that she couldn't stand it anymore, and she needed to find the strength to continue holding the knife. But since there was practically no energy left inside, she fell to the ground and tried to hold her head higher in order not to lose consciousness. She felt so bad that she tried to talk to herself and agree not to fall asleep under any circumstances. But it seems that even if she succeeds, it will not save her. Because a moment later, the door was opened by the man who was glad that the girl was finally dying. Having gone inside, he began to come closer and closer, and at the same time whisper to the girl that little beauty was kicking again. But now everything was different, because that man had complete power because of Ching Xiao's defenselessness. After that, all memories are cut off, and the girl no longer remembers what happened next. This made her think very negative thoughts, and so she immediately began to cry and tried to understand whether what she was afraid of really happened. This screaming and crying could be heard even through the doors, and for this reason Hujin immediately began to come closer and closer to the room. Finding it close enough, he immediately opened the door and said the girl's name several times. When Ching Xiao saw the guy, it seemed to her that the tears that were on her face immediately began to dry. All because she was incredibly happy to see him alive, and in fact this explained a lot that she could not understand. But still her mind was still filled with an incredible sense of panic even after she knew she was safe. Her body quickly gained strength, and jumping out of bed she ran point-blank to Chan Hujin. The guy reassured her and said that he was nearby and everything that was happening around was not a dream and she was really safe. 3 more girls entered the room, one of whom was a system, and Xiaoqing meanwhile said that she was glad that Ching Xiao had finally come to her senses and Jean could be calm. But this was not the last person who entered the room, since who appeared here last immediately asked what they were doing here. It was Hao Lianshan, and he asked all the girls if they were Hu Jin's friends. Meanwhile, the guy was just calming down Xiao and didn't even notice that someone else had entered the room. The old man went deeper into the room and noticed that the guy's friends looked like they were extremely attractive girls, and also asked which one of them was dear to his heart. But very quickly he said that he was actually here on business and wanted to explain a few subtleties to the guy. He then said that Landau competitions involve 3 people per clan. Therefore he was wondering who the 3 were who he decided to send to represent the clan of Spirit Lords. All 3 girls who were standing right next to the entrance to the room by that time said that they were volunteers and wanted to take part in the competition. Each of them had their own motive. For example, Xiaoqing said that she wanted to take part in competitions with her husband. And Ching Xiao said that she wanted to do something for the guy as a thank you. This is because he had previously found himself in a difficult situation because she asked Wang Tunglong for help. Hu Jin began to explain that Tunglong was originally in the Spirit Lord clan, and no one could have thought that he would betray them, so it was clearly not her fault. Listen to all this. The old man noticed that the guy's friends are very loyal and honest, and this is clearly something to be envied. He also noted that the guy should first think everything over carefully and tomorrow provide him with a list of all participants. After that, he began to move towards the exit of the room and laughed, saying that he was really interested in what Hu Jin would decide in the end. The guy didn't really like the situation, but the reality was based on the fact that the problem had to be solved somehow. Most likely during the competition, Landau will have to face poisons, so Ching Xiao's abilities will come in handy. Despite the fact that the grandfather from the Bai family did not want to let Xiaoqing go, the guy knew that she was the main character of the game and her powers were incredible. Looking at Qingxi, who showed with all her appearance that she also wanted to participate, the guy thought that she did not appear in the game often but claimed that she had the power of 10,000 spirits. However, she never used her potential. It was necessary to think even better, since now the girl acted as if she was already sure that she would win the competition. She also noticed that the guy had never seen her in action before and most likely wants her to become the avant-garde. Hu Jin then realized that it would be difficult to convince her. But in reality he only told Qingxi that he thought that she had already made some progress during her journey. Therefore he invited her to show and demonstrate her skills, and from Qingxi herself it was clear that she was not at all against it. But suddenly turning around, she also said that she was afraid that she might scare Hu Jin with her abilities. The guy just said that he was already scared to hell, and he went up to the tavern worker and said that they wanted to use the backyard of the hotel. The price for this was 2 liang for 2 hours. Even for a member of such a great clan it was a big price, but it still had to be paid. Just a few moments later they were all already on the street and took their starting position. The guy asked Qingxi not to hold back and convinced her that he could now withstand absolutely any attack. The girl told him that she was afraid that he might not be able to cope with what she was about to show him. She began to move her hands in space and at the same time asked those girls who were watching from the side to move away. Qingxi tried to use the graceful furious bloodsword technique, and from the energy around her body one could understand that she could do it. This energy spread more and more, but the speed with which it approached the target was not particularly impressive. For the system, this is an attack, as well as its name it seemed something unimpressive, but Xiaoqing thought that using all the power it would be difficult to hit the target. The guy in turn analyzed every step the girl took and tried to focus so as not to miss a single movement. He even closed his eyes because now everything that was happening there was at a level of energy that was better felt than seen. And he did not move at all, but in this situation it was an effective tactic since all the energy flows passed by. The girls who were spectators noticed that she missed and she needed to somehow correct this situation. Then Qingxi screamed that the guy was underestimating her and now she would show him what a real attack was. It was decided to use a fatal blow in order to accurately impress a member of the clan of Spirit Lords. At the same moment the phantom sword began to fly towards Hu Jin at a much more impressive speed. One of the girls who was watching from the side noticed that the sword she threw had consciousness and it could turn emptiness into reality. And by that time the grandfather also came closer to the group of observers and said that this was a pretty good attack. Although Qingxi has developed her own technique, it has not yet reached perfection in Muyang's opinion. He also said that in the state in which he sees the fight now, in his opinion, the girl still does not have enough strength. This whole attack flew at Jean at high speed with an incredibly loud sound, but at the very last moment he only put his finger forward and thereby destroyed all the energy. And then the guy said that Qingxi has no chance of participating in the competition. After this phrase, Qingxi became incredibly angry, and it could be seen with the naked eye. She constantly screamed and tried to explain to everyone around that her power of 10,000 demons that being in her body could surprise a guy, and that's why she was holding back. Of course, it was difficult for her to accept this defeat, so she said that she wanted revenge and then she would show all her power to the guy. Well, then Xiaoqing got into this dialogue and said that it looked like that girl had not heard of the expression "you like to play, know how to lose." After these words, Qingxi already switched to them and asked who even came up with such a stupid saying that makes no sense. But while she was trying to explain everything to the audience, a realization suddenly came to her, after which she began to walk towards Hu Jin. In her opinion, the guy did this on purpose, challenged her to a fight so that she would lose and not participate in the Landau competition. Coming closer, the guy explained that he really didn't want her to take part in the competition, but there was a good reason for this. And this reason is that he did so because there is a more serious matter that he would like to entrust exclusively to her. Because in the end, the fate of the Spirit Lord clan would depend solely on Qingxi's decision and actions. The girl was pleased to hear this, since all she demanded from the world at that moment was only respect. The guy began to explain that this time the struggle would be waged not only during the competition, but danger would also await after the competition. People like this, like the Beast Master clan and the like, would obviously not miss a chance to do anything inappropriate during a Lantau event. For the participants, these competitions are undoubtedly extremely dangerous, and everyone who participates in them understands this well. This is why Hu Jin needs a reliable person outside of the competition, who will control the situation from the outside. Then the guy very sharply and quickly raised his voice and said that he had a very important assignment for Qingxi as for a strong warrior from the clan of Spirit Lords. He entrusts this matter to her. Since she has the power of 10,000 demons, she will definitely be able to cope with the crimes and atrocities of her rivals. At first the girl didn't even know what to answer, because after such a powerful speech, but she needed time to digest all this information. But she very quickly made a decision the moment Chen, who used the Spirit Master clan's greeting, and hit himself in the heart. At the same time, he said that the girl would need to do this for the sake of the clan of Spirit Lords. Now literally for a few moments the girl didn't know what to say after all this, as she looked at Chun, who as if bewitched. And then when the realization had already come to her head, she made a signature greeting and said that the mission would be completed. The system meanwhile watched all this and heard all the dialogues very well. In her opinion, the belief system that the guy had just used was a little idiotic. Well, the guy is in his place. On the contrary, he was pleased with the result, and first of all pleased with himself. A short amount of time passed, and a large number of warriors and ordinary passers-by gathered in one place to begin the competition. Just before the start, the guy came closer to Haolian to give him the list of participants from the clan of Spirit Lords. Now that the elder of the Green Wave clan had the list, he said that he wished the young man to get ahead and win. The guy thanked him for this parting word, and in fact this gratitude was truly sincere. A second after the end of this dialogue, a special person hit the huge bell which was located in the center of the square with all his strength with a stick. Using the flying technique, the Haolian flew into the sky and said that the Lord was probably already tired of the Landau competition. Everyone below immediately began to scream, as many of them had been waiting for this moment for several years. Xiaoqing also succumbed to the general jubilation and said that they must definitely become winners this time. Hu Jin was glad that he would participate in competitions with such a beautiful girl, and for a while he looked at her as if bewitched. While all this was happening, a system appeared near him, and despite the fact that it was not on the list of participants, it could be here because it is almighty. In addition, she explained to the guy that she would always be near him and would either simplify everything or on the contrary make it more difficult. Hu Jin was obviously not happy with these words, but also understood that he could not do anything about it. While he was trying to think about all this, one of the participants pointed to the sky and thereby attracted the attention of everyone nearby. Energy began to circulate in the sky and all participants realized that the competition was about to begin. In the first round of the Landau competition, they will need to get out of a mysterious place about which they still know almost nothing. Huene explained that 3 people per clan are participating and they will have to go through the portal to get to the right place, and they will be given a period of 7 days to complete the task. The girl who was on the team of the clan of spirit lords suddenly noticed something strange in the sky during this speech. So she pointed at this phenomenon with her finger and asked Chun Hu-jin what it was. It turned out that it was something like a storm which swirled within itself exactly the signs for each of the clan members. Huene explained that once they get to the competition site, these signs will need to be carefully stored, because once they lose them, they have lost. They will only need to do 2 things: protect their nameplates and collect them from other competitors. According to the rules, 1 plate brings 1 point, but if you lose a team member, then you get as many as 5 points. Rising even higher and moving his body with the help of wind currents, Huene announced the start of the competition. The wind that he created underneath himself headed towards each participant and began to move them in space. Hu-jin grabbed his 2 team members and ordered them to hold tight, as they would now move to the place where everything else would happen. While moving, the old man also said that all the contestants can resort to different methods to achieve their goal. However, if they want to harm someone, then he will be merciless towards them. While in flight, the guy noticed that they would land on the ground very soon and therefore used a technique to summon a lifeless slime under his feet. This softened the fall very much, and the girls and the guy landed quite calmly and did not receive any damage. As soon as Xiaoqing landed, she immediately began to look around, because here the world looked very charming to me. She also noticed that on the island where they are now, there is a very strong energy that she feels right now. Coming closer to Hu-jin, Ching Xiao said that there would most likely be not only battles but also some kind of checks. The guy answered her that of course there will be other checks, but with his strength they will quickly cope, since it was not in vain that he trained so much. Very soon it turned out that Huene and his brothers could observe everything that was happening with the help of ordinary wind currents. He also said that Chun Hu-jin is quite arrogant this year and acts accordingly. Huene Guizong noticed this and asked his brother if he had talked about this particular variable before. Looking at the large display of all the characters, he said that naturally he meant this, since quite a number of interesting people have appeared in recent years. And it seems that during these competitions that person was Chun Hu-jin. Of course no one knew what he could throw out, and for this most likely it was necessary to wait a little for everything to become more obvious. At a fairly considerable distance from the venue of the competition, bets were now being accepted on who would be the final winner of the competition. And here there were a large number of people, and literally in a few minutes so many bets were placed here that it would be possible to buy an entire city with these efforts. Basically all these people said that if Linchin took part in the competition, he would definitely become the winner. But it seemed that he would not be participating this time, and because of this everyone who left the bets was not very happy. Meanwhile, the action moved to one of the islands where a member of one particularly famous clan met with a large beast. I forgot the tiger, which had incredibly high speed and could quickly catch up with its target. The movement of an ordinary person, of course, was much slower, and therefore he ran only a few meters. He threw his nameplate aside and shouted the game that he was giving up. Van, who stood a short distance from him, picked up that very tablet, and now he had it in his collection. Then he said that now no one will stand in their way, since their clan of the Lord and Beasts is simply invincible thanks to their tactics. One of the subordinates also turned to the master to say that this time they had enough spirit beasts with them to finish off Chun. He replied, advising him not to worry, as he would send Jinpeng to scout out the target's location. By this name he of course meant a spiritual animal, and added that no one could ever hide from his gaze, since as soon as this eagle discovers their location it will immediately begin to approach and begin its mission. The look of this eagle was as if it was really ready to tear into any enemy right on the spot with its own beak. Wang also said that as soon as he finds the target, he will immediately begin to lower his altitude at lightning speed in order to kill Jin on the spot. But in fact everything happened differently, since as soon as the eagle approached them, within a few minutes he was on the spit. While eating this food, Ching Xiao asked the guy if they had accidentally broken the rules, thereby killing this animal. But Bai replied that there was nothing wrong with that, since the clan of Beast Lords considered ritual animals as pets, so no one would refuse to eat for free. At some point the guy heard a voice from the side who said that it was very cruel to destroy animals. It turned out that a short distance from the group a man was sitting on a tree branch and was talking about how Hu-jin had just been incredibly lucky. Just a few moments later this man came down from the tree, and for some time he was silent. But soon he asked Hu Jin what kind of monster he was and why he behaved like a monster. Now the guy had several questions in his head, namely, is this really someone he doesn't want to see right now? Since by all circumstances everything pointed to the fact that in front of him was none other than the main character of the game named Linqing. Xiaoqing, when she recognized the one who was now standing in front of her, she was very surprised and said his name. The guy realized that now his problems would become bigger when the girl said that she and Linqing had not seen each other for a very long time. The main character asked Xiaoqing why she was suddenly next to this monster and asked if he really forced her. The guy couldn't believe that he forgot that the two of them were the main characters of the game and clearly something connected them. The hero extended his hand to Xiaoqing and said that she needed to follow him, and also added that he was taking her away from here. But the guy was not ready to put up with this and asked the hero if he really was an empty place for him with whom he didn't even need to talk. Ignore as a phenomenon the guy was ready to endure, but when the heroes try to take his wife away from him, this is clearly a big problem. He began to use one of his techniques, but Xiaoqing beat him to the punch and used her snake to launch a surprise attack. This attack was so unexpected that even the most heroic was surprised that it happened, and for some time he did not know what to do. At the same time, I am dodging the attacks of this snake. He asked the girl what she was doing, and she just shouted and said that the hero is stupid if he thinks that she is still the same Bai Shiaoqing whom he once deceived. A large number of hieroglyphs appeared around her body, each of which emitted a large amount of energy. And at the same time she summoned a large number of snakes and ordered that man to stay away from her. But despite everything that was happening, Linqing was still confident in his abilities, and at the same time avoiding said that the girl was still just as impulsive. Therefore he dashed back and using his musical instrument destroyed all the snakes that attacked him. Now he was on the same branch on which he had been until the moment he decided to come down from the tree. And he told the girl that if everything worked out this way, then he would have to teach him a lesson about what price you could pay if you act rashly. At that same second, a large cloud of harmful energy began to spread from the tree directly in the direction of the girl. She was very scared when this happened, since the internal energy in her body was not yet enough to repel such an attack. Everything that was happening now on this island, of course, did not go unnoticed by the people who came to watch the competition. Most of all, they were surprised that Linqing was still participating in these competitions this year, although no one had seen him before. It also seemed interesting to them that such a strong opponent would soon fight with Hu Jin, whom he had already killed once. Grandfather Bai meanwhile moved directly to Haolian, and from there, he watched what was happening on the island. But his old friend stopped him when he wanted to intervene, explaining that once the competition began, outsiders could not interfere in the course of events. But the grandfather began to shout that his granddaughter was now on the battlefield, and in no case could he be indifferent. An old friend tried to explain that he could not go because otherwise she would be disqualified. It didn't matter to Bai. While he was talking about this, a very large explosion occurred in one of the mirrors through which what was happening on the islands was shown. The realization that this mirror had just shown the island where the battle between Xiaoqing and Hu Jin took place did not give any peace to the grandfather. Therefore he turned his head towards his friend and said that if something happens to his granddaughter, he will pay very dearly for it. After this explosion died down, the girl began to peer into the mirrors to see what happened after all this. Nothing was visible, and the thought even crept into his mind that after this explosion anything could happen. The crowd thought that Xiaoqing had been burned to the ground. But in fact Hu Jin was at the site of this battle and said in a confident voice that it would not be so easy to get rid of them. An incredibly large vortex began to form around his body, which extinguished the fire that had started after Linqing's attack. Being in such a situation, the guy said that Linqing was in vain looking down on him again. The guy managed to protect his wife. Also he said with confidence in his soul and in his eyes that that hero should not have done this to his girlfriend, since now he would have to pay. Everyone who came to watch the competition was surprised at what had just happened. They didn't understand what kind of magic Hu Jin was using if he could block the spirit fire so easily. The hero meanwhile only thought that before his death this guy was an ordinary person who was clearly not remarkable in anything. It was difficult to comprehend how he was even able to master such a talent in such a short time. Therefore Linqing directly asked the guy what kind of person he was if he was able to block the ritual fire. The guy didn't quite like this question, but he decided that in this situation it would be very pretentious to answer it. And he said that the hero has very strange questions. And then added that he was the Chun who was killed by the hero and whom he almost cuckolded. But the hero using the technique of music said that in front of him was still the same bastard, and apparently he was suspicious since he even asked this question. More and more vibrant musical equipment began to appear around him, and he advised the hero to get ready to play it again. The girl who stood close to Huene said that now he will use the songs of the Dark Sea, which destroys a person's state of mind in a matter of minutes. Even to the place where the crowd was watching what was happening, Lin Chen's supernatural power penetrated, and it was very difficult for them to withstand it. Halian, who had more strength than all those people, concluded that if Lin Chen entered the battle, then victory was in his hands. Well, then his brother noticed that he was actually not sure of his victory, and even more so, he was not sure how Chun would act in this situation. He turned his head to Muyang and told him that he shouldn't worry since the guy still had a pretty good chance. It was very difficult for the girls due to the fact that they were incredibly close to the epicenter of the spread of the melody, which was destroying them from the inside. Having assessed the situation, Huene ordered Ching Xiao to use the green bell to create a protective barrier, and this had to be done as quickly as possible. The girl picked up this bell and began to use the technique that had been passed down to her family from generation to generation. Thanks to the saturation of energy, this artifact became stronger every second and thereby created a barrier that at first resembled the size of a pea. But after some time, the protective barrier completely covered the girls who were standing close to one another. But the guy came out of this barrier because he did not feel much damage from all this melody that came from the lynching flute. The enemy began to use a different technique, and then the guy realized that now he could calmly act and carry out an attack. At the same time dodging the blows, he thought that Lin Chen was now really behaving like a typical advertising hero of any game. Despite the fact that the guy had time to think through all the next steps, he still made sure not to make any stupid mistakes. Using his strength, he tried to act so that no one would get hurt. This is how the guy thought about the hero whom he was going to punish. Huene tried to concentrate as much as possible so that during the subsequent blow the maximum amount of concentrated energy would be directly in his body. And when he got as close as possible to the goal, he said quietly what he would now teach such an arrogant hero like him a lesson. But at some point he heard an answer that said that the guy was so naive that as soon as he rushed forward he had already fallen for the bait. And the guy was a little lost when he felt a spread of energy around his body which slowly began to envelop him. This all happened under the words of the hero that the trap had slammed shut long ago, and now the guy had no chance of winning the fight. All this energy literally in a matter of seconds was able to completely limit the guy's movement, and he could no longer even move. Then the hero said that as soon as he moved the music shackled him. But he didn't yet know that the hero actually had a plan B, and now he was going to use it. Water began to pour out directly from Huene's face and gradually spread into the space near Lin Chen. This water was becoming more and more, and it was moving much faster than the energy that anyone had ever released. All due to the fact that now the guy was in a position in which he could direct the maximum amount of energy into this attack. The hero did not understand how this was possible because now he was in a sphere that consisted entirely of water. At the same time, a water dragon began to fly around Huene's body, and the hero watching all this could not understand what kind of metamorphosis this was and where he learned this from. Those watching what was happening were also surprised and only now realized how strong Huene had become after rising from the dead. But none of them could understand what kind of spell it was, since it was clearly not from the program of the clan of spirit lords. There was only one person who understood exactly what was happening now. And it was Muyang Bai. The girls who were delighted with what happened came closer to the guy to say how cool he was. But the guy only told them that he did it by accident, although in fact he put a lot of effort into this action. By that time the hero was already completely covered in water and was immobilized by a large amount of liquid. From the way he behaved here, one could understand that he clearly did not expect such an attack from the enemy whom he underestimated. The guy looking at all this thought only about whether Lin Chen knew that Huene knew that he was terribly afraid of water. The team that was on the nearby island decided to take advantage of this moment and sent the spiritual animal straight to Lin Chen. In fact, it took Tunglong quite a lot of effort to control such a large monster. This monster was able to destroy the water protection that was around the hero with just one movement, and he immediately began to fall to the ground. But the blow he received was already serious enough to cause internal bleeding. For him, everything became even worse when the spiritual animal did not stop there, but on the contrary began to develop a new attack. It struck again while he was still in the air, and because of this an explosion appeared near Lin Chen's body which was incredibly bright. This explosion could be seen from afar, as could his body, which began to fall down. The damage he received now was incredibly large, and considering that his body was immobilized, it also flew straight into the ground at high speed. In just a moment he flew to the ground, and when his body touched the ground, another small explosion occurred. Then all the subordinates from the Beast Lord clan shouted that Wang had just incredibly dealt with the strong lynching. And their leader now, I was thinking that fortunately their golden eagle sent them information about the whereabouts of Jin, and therefore it is worth waiting for his return and feeding him well when he arrives. But when the subordinate used Burkut's feathers to understand where he was, it became clear from his face that something had gone wrong. It became especially scary at the moment when Hu Jin began waving a spit through which a whole and ready-made bird soul was threaded. The guy licked this bird and at the same time asked Van if he was really looking for this item, which seemed quite tasty to the guy. All his subordinates together with Tunglong himself could not believe that this was happening in reality, since this golden eagle was already like a family member for them. Therefore Van said that he would now show the guy what the wrath of the Beastmaster clan was. With just one movement he released the dazzling Juchi tiger from the special magic bag and ordered him to attack. The guy at that moment realized that he had little strength and he needed to give someone from his team the opportunity to act. Therefore he ordered Xiaoqing to use the snow-white snake dance. But he did not take into account the fact that the current Xiaoqing had not yet learned this technique, and in fact it was like that. The girl asked what he meant, but also Hu Jin understood that he had enough time and enough skills to teach her this. Therefore he approached the girl from behind and said that now in a few seconds he could teach her this powerful technique. With his hands he guided her fingers and asked her to repeat the sentence after him word for word like a real mantra. Thousands of white plum blossoms blossomed, fire trees and silver flowers lit up. When the girl said this, the snake that was on her body at that very second realized that it needed to attack. This snake even had a name, and Xiaoqing, when I was a child I gave it to her. The beast was called Yun Liner, but when this snake tried to attack the tiger, it only crashed into its face at high speed without causing much damage. The tiger did not receive any damage and only looked in surprise at the snake, which hit his forehead and fell to the ground. Chun Hu Jin, along with the girls he competed with, was slightly surprised by what just happened, and he even became a little scared at the moment when the tiger prepared to attack and was ready to tear the targets into several pieces. But no one even noticed that the snake that fell to the floor immediately after the fall began to emit energy, and a moment later received a large number of tentacles. These tentacles immediately immobilized the tiger, which had just tried to attack Hu Jin's team. While the clan of Beast Lords did not understand what was happening, the Jin team rejoiced at what they had accomplished. And when they looked closer and raised their heads, they saw in the sky the image of a girl who had lived all this time in Yun Liner. This girl, who levitated for some time in the sky, was incredibly beautiful, but she was inactive for quite a short time, because within a second she directed a large number of tentacles from her hand towards the target. Looking at the result of her actions, she was proud of what she had accomplished, and in the end she hissed like a real snake. After this, her physical shell gradually began to turn into more transparent until only the original Yun snake remained inside her body. This snake remained descending and after a short time flew into the hands of Xiaoqing, who said about her snake that it had done a good job. When the guy approached her, he said that the first transformation did not work out as it should, but next time it would obviously be better. A positive aura reigned in Hu Jin's team, while Wang Tunglong was incredibly angry and shouted that he would never forgive the guy. He decided to go Alan and told his subordinates that even if the tiger failed, it was still just flowers. Having released the magical bag of spiritual animals, he ordered them all to attack the target and tear it to pieces. Now that a large number of incredibly powerful animals surrounded Hu Jin's group, all the spectators realized that he was in big trouble. Some of them stipulated that so many wild beasts would clearly be able to defeat him, since before this they had already managed to eliminate several teams. The girls who were in Chen's team were of the same opinion and believed that they now definitely had at least a dozen opponents. Since the animals did not attack immediately, Ching Xiao even had a little time to discover that each animal had a jade tablet hanging on its neck. Wang, in fact, was only able to take these beasts on the condition that each of them would have a similar sign. But now he even asked a very reasonable question, namely, he was interested in whether Hu Jin's death was worth all this. The youngest girl, who was Bai Shiaoqing, shouted to the guy that there were too many opponents now. But she, along with Ching Xiao, was not afraid, since the two of them were confident that the young master would deal with everyone without any problems. Van watched all this from the side and was clearly pleased with the fact that his opponents were greatly underestimating him. Therefore he gave the order to his beasts to attack now and tear the targets into small pieces. But the guy was ready and took a few steps forward and told his girls to carefully monitor his movement, as this was a great opportunity to learn something new. But just as he prepared to use one of his most powerful techniques, a hysterical scream was heard from the side. Immediately after this scream, the team witnessed an incredibly large amount of green energy spreading throughout space. This energy was directed, and it went to almost every beast that was now preparing to tear Jean into pieces. The source of this voice was a man who stood near a mighty tree, shouting that the aura of his sword extended for many miles around. It was a sword of icy light, and thanks to the energy it contained in its blade, every animal received incredibly heavy damage. There were 19 explosions, and absolutely all the animals were destroyed after a massive explosion occurred inside their bodies. In addition, the one who created all this energy was not ready to stop and used the incredible wind technique. The streams of this very wind were so powerful that they could pick out trees with their roots and lift them into the air to join the command of the beast lords. They flew into the air at high speed, and Jean even managed to get scared because he didn't understand who could have such great power. But at the very last moment he noticed that the one who had just essentially saved him and eliminated the entire team was none other than Lin Qing. But if you look at him from the outside, you could understand that now he looked like a woman. But despite all this, her eyes were focused, and she told the guy that she would deal with him a little later. The guy meanwhile was looking at Lin Qing, but his eyes were clearly not focused on her eyes. This was due to the fact that after all the damage received, Lin Qing had a lot of bare parts of her body which attracted Hu Jin's attention. The team of beast lords, which had been flying through the air all this time because of Lin Qing's energy, did not understand why they were doing this if it was Jean who was staring at the heroine herself and not them. Well, that one only dispersed the wind and thereby carried the opponents further and further away from the scene of events. It quickly became clear that in a few seconds they would be taken outside the island and were unlikely to be able to return. After this all happened, a large rain of jade tablets began to fall to the ground and fly straight into the hands of Xiaoqing and Ching Xiao. The task turned out to be completed for the guy, since now they had the largest number of signs of all the participants in the competition. But everything changed the moment Lin Qing made it clear to their team that they were far from the finish line. She took her flute and told the guy that no matter how many signs he collected, defeat would await him very soon. Well, as soon as she prepared to use this flute to attack him with musical equipment, a vibration suddenly began under the feet of everyone who was there. This strong vibration even created a crack in the ground, and the guy assumed that the enemy wanted to use the hermit technique. But Lin Qing knew nothing about this. Suddenly they all heard a scream from the side, who asked everyone present what they were doing here. This was a man who ran away from the source of the earthquake at very high speed and ordered everyone else to run away too, because behind them was the one because of whom all this is happening now. An incredible force scattered pieces of earth and entire trees in different directions. The cause of all this chaos was a demon wolf who smelled blood. This wolf was incredibly angry and constantly carried out attacks, destroying opponents left and right. All this was accompanied by hysterical screams of people who were trying to hide and at the same time begging for help. The closest people to this beast were the members of the Vanishing Moon's crew, one of whom said that it doesn't matter how strong it is since it's just a beast. Therefore that team member immediately used the technique and drew several characters in the air with his finger, thereby activating a large amount of energy. This energy was converted into an attack, and a very large number of roots appeared from under the earth which should have caused damage to the demon wolf. But since it was an animal, it sensed danger and jumped to the side, thereby avoiding any damage. The clan member was very surprised that this just happened, since there was a big bet on this attack. Things got even worse when the wolf sensed where all this energy was coming from and began to run towards this team. Meanwhile, Haolian and his brothers watched everything that was happening through special mirrors, and only Muyang did not understand what was happening. So he asked his friend how this animal could harm people at the tournament, but he replied that it seemed like it was God's will. From time immemorial, the animals of this island rested underground until the moment when the clan of beast lords showed the world many monsters. Then everything changed as the animal blood that sprinkled the ground awakened the demon wolf. and when this wolf awakened, all he could do was move around this island, eliminating all opponents left and right. But still he had a rather significant problem, and this problem was called the Spirit Lord clan team. Jin, who was the captain of this team, used a defensive technique before this wolf demon approached them. This created a small hemispherical protective dome, which greatly interested the demon. After that, the guy said that this demon wolf had been accumulating energy for centuries, which means the shield would not last long. Therefore, you need to find a weakness and strike first. Of course, being the main character of the game, Lin Cheng said that she would go and eliminate this demon with the help of her flute. But when she tensed her muscles a little, even more of her clothes tore, exposing her shoulders even more. She felt incredibly ashamed when this happened, and she realized that if she moved on, she would completely lose all her outer clothing. But suddenly, at very high speed, some object flew into her body, which she quickly realized was Hu Jin's outerwear. She turned her head and saw a guy who said that if there is no need, then the girls should just stay here with him, since he is reluctant to let Lin Cheng go alone. At the same time, he ordered his team to monitor the shield and feed it with their internal energy if it begins to break. It was necessary to take some action, and for this reason Hu Jin prepared to push off in order to deliver a surprise blow to the enemy. He accumulated a large amount of energy in his legs and pushed off and flew straight through the protective barrier straight up. The demon wolf had a good reaction, so he noticed that his opponent was and immediately tried to attack him. But the guy's movement was quite fast, and therefore within a few moments he was in the nearby forest. I move along it and dodge the attacks of the demon wolf. He thought that this beast is not very confident on its paws. Probably due to many years of being killed in the guise of a beast, it does not remember at all what it is like to be human. But now it was necessary to adapt to reality, and the reality was that now the enemy is an ordinary beast. Does this mean that he needs to be treated like an animal and fought like an animal? Hu Jin used one of his secret techniques and realized that he needed to tame this beast in order to effectively eliminate it. The spectators watched this with surprised faces, as they did not know that this guy could use the blood spell. But what happened next became even more amazing, and even Haolian can answer. Since they noticed that this guy is not capable of much more than just a regular blood spell, which is already a pretty powerful technique. In addition, Hu Jin was able to turn the blood spell into a sword, which was already an incredibly amazing talent. And this sword flew at great speed straight into the net, which blocked the passage of the demon wolf. Everyone who was now participating in the competition suddenly stopped in order to watch how everything would happen next. When the sword flew right to the target, the guy looked at the wolf's eyes and noticed something very strange. This strangeness gave him no rest and constantly sowed uncertainty in his actions in his head. So now he saw that the wolf was crying, and the tears were very clearly visible in his eyes. He let the action go a little in order to understand why he suddenly acted this way and what made him cry now. All the guy wanted now was for the wolf to open his heart for him and show him what was causing the problems. Immediately, Hu Jin moved into the consciousness of this wolf and saw a Moldavian man there. At some point, someone approached this man from the side and called him a shadow mastiff. Coming closer, this man said that he had found a master who needed his protection, and therefore tomorrow he would be able to follow him and explore distant lands. This was good news for the shadow mastiff, but he felt uneasy because he did not know when he would have a master. But his friend calmed him down and said that they were the demon wolf clan, and therefore they were destined to protect only one master throughout their lives. Therefore this meeting will happen one day and will be incredibly fateful. But fateful meetings don't come so soon, and you have to wait. The shadow mastiff remembered for himself that he must wait, and then he will be able to get himself a master with whom he will be ready to go through thick and thin. He thought that he would most likely have to wait an incredibly long time, and this actually happened. Due to the large amount of time without a master, the wolf began to go crazy. His ancestors constantly said that the shadow mastiff had matured very much and had never found an owner. Following the rules of the clan, he will have to leave these lands and sleep underground due to the fact that during all this time he could not find the master. The ancestors were unhappy that the shadow mastiff did not accept the rules and decided to show him what would happen if he continued to do this. They told him those words that were incredibly painful for him due to the fact that for some time he was too weak. They repeated that a non-shadow mastiff type demon wolf is not capable of anything and has too limited strength. The cells also added that he should have been eliminated a long time ago, and then he would not have disgraced their glory. The guy, being incredibly depressed, repeated the word eliminate several times in his head. And at some point he thought that this had really gone on for too long and he was already tired of suffering. Then in his head all the moments when he trained and when he tried to become better were connected, but he just couldn't do it. Therefore the Shadow Mastiff decided that it was time to end and stop fighting. But at some point Huene appeared in front of him, who said that if he really wanted everything to end, he would not have woken up today from the shed animal blood. It was then that the realization came to the Shadow Mastiff's head, but most of all he was surprised at who this guy was. Well, what he saw was the bloody sword that was in his hand and which emitted a large amount of fiery energy in different directions. Spectators who were watching what was happening asked the guy to warn him next time before doing something like that. But he said that this was just an event and he had not even used it to its full potential yet. Moreover, in order to appear even more powerful in the eyes of others, he added that this Shadow Mastiff was actually not that big. Then the guy's voice became quieter, and turning to the Shadowverse, he said that he wanted to give up only because he had not met Huene before. His eyes lit up, but so far the guy did not understand why they became like that and whether the beast understood him. Then, drawing a few hieroglyphs in the air, the guy turned to the demon wolf and asked why he allows people to underestimate their own spirit beast. Since for such a very strong beast it is obvious that he has enough strength to prove the opposite to many. The hieroglyphs in the air became more and more numerous, and the fiery curtain around Huene's body became more and more obvious. Both the girls from the team of the Spirit Lord clan and Lin Ching, looking at all this, concluded that now he will use a two-layer spiritual word. And this could only mean that the guy will not eliminate this enemy now since he has other plans. Most likely Huene really wants to tame this wolf and make him obey. It turns out that the guy went straight into the consciousness of this animal and asked what his name was. He, without thinking twice, said that everyone around him called him Aoing, and immediately he also asked what the guy's name was. Huene introduced himself and noted that it was really not surprising that Aoing was so small deep down. The guy didn't really like this, so he said that he shouldn't look down on him and now he will beat the stranger. But Chun asked him has he really been lonely for so long that he wants to bite his own master. Therefore he advised him to be more mature if he was indeed old. The word master stuck in Ying's head very confidently and for a long time, and he even repeated it several times. It was hard to believe that it was possible. Very soon he would finally be able to wait for his own master. Coming closer, the guy advised him not to waste the sayings that he had written especially for him, since now that he has an owner, Aoing has meaning in his life and has the opportunity to grow up. Meanwhile, in reality, everyone who was watching what was happening from the outside noticed that the demonic wolf was becoming smaller and smaller. This happened until the moment when this animal became the size of an ordinary Labrador dog. The Vanishing Moon clan gave the order to launch an attack and take away the jade tablets from the team that was calming the beast demons. Xiaoqing responded to all this shout with her own scream and said that it was outrageous, while asking how they even dare to attack when Huene casts a spell that will help everyone. But it seemed that the enemy had no time for this, since they aimed several swords at once right at the back of the guy who was now immersed in meditation. One of the girls who was on his team screamed in order to attract the guy's attention so that he could defend himself. But at the very last moment, when the swords had almost reached his back, some kind of energy cut them all and pieces of metal fell to the ground. Moreover, this very energy dealt several significant blows to the members of this team who had just thrown all those swords. Aoing turned to this group of opponents and asked if they really wanted to harm the owner. Having stood up to his full height, the boy asked if they really thought that being in this form had made him a weakling. The girls who had been waiting for their master for a long time were incredibly happy and immediately jumped towards Huene. They hugged him and were generally happy that he was alive and in perfect order. Aoing, meanwhile, he asked if he, after becoming a subordinate, could also be attracted to the sisters. But the guy told him that he couldn't do that. While Lin Cheng was watching the communication between the subordinate and the master, she suddenly noticed that some kind of projectile was flying towards Jean. Therefore, with just one movement of her hand, she sent this projectile to the side and asked the attacker what he was doing. It turns out that one person raised his hand up in order to send a signal flare upward in the direction of Jean. He also explained that soon all the students who were participating in the competition would come here, and then they would create a lot of problems. An attack of almost 10,000 people, in his opinion, would clearly be enough to tear the Spirit Lord clan team apart. This man was incredibly angry because Huene had thought that he could win the Lantau competition until that moment. Now as more people approached the battle site, the man who fired the flare said that he would soon feel revenge for his bloody massacre of the clans. But Hu Jin's reaction to all this was strange, to put it mildly, since initially he ran up to the man and asked if what he said was true. Namely, he was interested in whether there would really be more than 10,000 people against him now and whether he was not bluffing, since now such a number of opponents was exactly what he wanted. Chun was happy that he finally had the opportunity to train his little children. Xiaoqing and Ching Xiao were indignant that the guy said that because they didn't know that he had children. But he quickly justified himself and said that he had the wrong children in mind and at the same time focused the energy of his right hand. One launch of directed energy was enough to create a portal from which modern heavy tanks codenamed Tiger began to emerge. As soon as these tanks left the portal, some of the competition participants immediately began to run away as they understood what it was. The man who launched the flare also wondered, since he had never seen such things before. The rest of the participants were more confident, and some of them even asked if the guy was really trying to scare them with several pieces of iron. But Hu Jin only told them all that the youth of all clans, even if their cultivation level is not high and not very good, they apparently do not study well. At the same time, calling the control center of all this equipment, he asked the opponents whether they really used all the construction lessons exclusively for sleep. His opponents did not understand what he meant when he said this, and most of them continued to threaten him with violence. Then he listened to this for a while, and then Hu Jin pressed the button which had already become real and meant putting military equipment into action. A sight appeared before his eyes, pointing it at the target. He could give the order to proceed to destruction. At that same second, all the tanks that emerged from the portal began firing from smoothbore guns and subcaliber machine guns that were on board. The shelling did not stop, and the opponents scattered in different directions. I don't understand where these chariots got so much power. Someone from the Waning Moon clan even tried to erect a shield in order to protect themselves from a high-explosive fragmentation shell. But this was barely enough to absorb all the energy from the explosion that appeared after the projectile came into contact with the shield. The man fell to the ground and couldn't believe that almost the most powerful defensive technique he knew had just not survived even one attack from this chariot. Members of all other clans scattered in different directions and decided to retreat behind a small slope so as not to be fired upon. But the tanks continued their movement and continuously fired in different directions, sometimes hitting opponents. Hu Jin, together with his team, was on one of these tanks and constantly shouted towards the opponents, urging them to be ready to be destroyed. Ching Xiao was also on this tank and noticed that the young master behaves a little differently in peacetime. Lynching, who also couldn't go anywhere, rejected the guy's offer to join their team. Moreover, after the refusal, she said that she herself was quite capable of defending herself, but during this phrase her stomach growled loudly. Ching Xiao decided to make fun of us about this and told the girl that now is time for lunch and they need to eat a little before the distant battles. The group moved to an area where they could escape the fighting and cooked some fried rice in a large cast iron cauldron. They were all inside watching Ching Xiao carefully prepare all this food and listening to Xiaoqing's praise. When the food was prepared, she gave it to Bai first due to the fact that she constantly talked and attracted attention to herself. That girl said that Ching Xiao's cooking skills are getting better and better and have probably already reached their peak. But Ching Xiao, turning to the guy, only said that thanks to the young master's kitchen utensils, which can enhance spiritual power, she was able to prepare such a delicious meal. Don't sleep na. The girl picked up another small bowl of food and handed it to Hu Jin so that he could also gain some strength. But the guy decided to give this food to Lynching, who with all her appearance tried to show that she did not need it. Then he began to move this food closer and closer to her nose so that the girl would smell the aroma and break faster. After a few seconds this would have happened and he snatched the bowl from the guy's hands. The girl said that she hoped that the guy didn't put poison in it. The hunger was so strong that she couldn't even stand it anymore and took a large spoonful of fried rice with mushrooms and meat. When this food entered her body, it felt like her first love in the 4th grade. She didn't understand at all why the food was so delicious. She had never eaten grains of rice that were so elastic and soaked in broth. Hu Qin took advantage of this moment and, coming closer to the girl, said that he could not believe that a girl with such a slender face would eat so much. His reaction was more down-to-earth since Xiaoqing, who saw that Lynching had eaten all the food, was more angry. But she calmed down when Ching Xiao said that she would cook more and add even more longevity mushrooms to this portion. In the situation that arose in this cave, Hu Jin was grateful to fate that he was reborn in this game as Hu Jin. The guy seemed strange to Lynching after she ate all the food, but she decided to come to terms with what was happening, since so far he had not done anything out of bounds. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, everything was simply terrible for representatives of other clans. The tanks were such powerful weapons that they had already begun to crush opponents with their tracks. But among all the defeated opponents, there was one who especially wanted Huene to finally lose. Therefore, they made a very important decision to contact the Hall Master. In his opinion, it's time for Chun to die. Then the action shifted, and now everything revolved around Mutan, who was standing near a cage with a lot of small birds. He constantly fed them but stopped at the moment when some kind of portal began to appear near him. When this portal appeared, the person who appeared from there said that the situation was bad and would obviously get worse. He also explained that this boy named Huene was much stronger than he thought, and even Tunglong was beaten by him, and their subordinates were all eliminated. Mutanyu in turn said that all this did not matter since from the very beginning, he did not hope that they would be able to do anything, but in truth, he did not think that they would be so weak. So he explained to the person who contacted him that he had been raising his birds for a very long time, and it seemed like now was the time to use them. The man from the portal was surprised that he really wanted to do this since in front of him was a very interesting and deadly creature. Namely, it was a Shenchuan bird capable of crossing all boundaries and reaching a variety of fantastic places. Moreover, they are used not only for this, and at the same time when Mutan said this they all tore the cage and flew to freedom. The catch was that, in this world, the nicer things are the more deceptive they become. Meanwhile, in an ambush set up by several clans in the forest, one of the men said that they had no chance of winning and they should just give up. They constantly argued among themselves, and someone made excuses and said that no one could have known before the battle how powerful Huene was. Suddenly a girl got into this dialogue and said that since everyone had given up, there was absolutely no need for an alliance. This girl's name was Gong Yao, and she was a member of the Spring Wind clan, and added that in any case there will not be only one winner in the first round, so you need to rely on your own abilities. Therefore, looking at all her subordinates, she gave them the order to leave in order to disconnect from this union. While they were leaving, one of the union men said that only a simple-minded person and a woman are difficult to support. It was decided to release them. Some time passed, and one of the subordinates decided to ask the Gong Yao what they should do next. She told her that they would let two dogs fight and then see how they suffered losses and pick up signs somewhere in the process. Among their team, there was also a girl who was more warm-blood and said that this method of fighting was not very attractive. Then the commander told her that as long as victory could be achieved, no one would care whether the process was attractive or inglorious. It should not be forgotten that the clans now treated the Spring Wind clan very poorly, saying that they were the ones who opened brothels throughout the city. This time Gong Yao promised that they would definitely achieve results in the competition so that everyone around them would not dare to underestimate them. While she was talking about this, a pretty bird flew up to her whose feathers were completely purple. The subordinate girls were touched by her appearance and were surprised that she did not fly away from fear but rather came closer. When this bird sat on Gong Yao's hand, all his subordinates agreed that they must be strong in order to achieve everyone's benefit. The commander agreed with this since now the main idea was that just because they are beautiful, their efforts should not be ignored. But at some point, the pretty bird bit the commander's finger and immediately flew away. The subordinates could not understand what was happening to Gong Yao as she quickly began to lose strength and gradually fall to the ground. A moment later, a very large number of birds appeared and began to fly towards the girls at a much higher speed. They were so fast and invisible that within a second each of them had at least one bite. The damage spread throughout the body incredibly quickly, and within seconds everyone was infected. Huene, meanwhile, he was in the very cave where they ate and heard that Xiaoqing was most likely having a not very pleasant dream. This could be understood by the screams and because she even hit her husband once while sleeping. Turning his head, the guy witnessed the girl waving her fists trying to defend herself. I moved my body closer to her. Huene tried to calm her down and say that now no one will hurt her anymore, just like him. They hugged and lay there for a few more minutes until Bai Shiaoqing finally fell asleep. The guy thought a few more times that he was really happy to be in Huene's body. So many girls thought about him, and he was no longer against his role. At some point in these dreams, Huene heard from the side someone's voice asking for help in a slightly quiet voice. Coming out, Huene tried to understand where this voice was coming from because suddenly this voice disappeared. But when he tried to listen, someone came up to him from behind and grabbed his arm with an exhausted hand. It was Gong Yao, and with the last of her strength, she asked Huene to help him as her body temperature was rising every second. Some time passed, and in the cave in which Huene's team was located, everyone slowly began to wake up. The first one to wake up was Ching Xiao. and the reason for her awakening was that she began to smell some kind of foreign smell. The smell became stronger, and Xiaoqing, who also woke up, noticed that the aroma was slightly cloying and incredibly disgusting. Looking around, they decided to understand where the young master was now and could not understand where he was. Then everyone ran out into the street, and Hu Jin's wife began shouting his name in order to understand where he was now. But at some point she saw her husband, who raised his hand to draw attention to himself. What she saw in front of her was difficult to explain, and the guy also shouted that it was just a misunderstanding. Several members of the Spring Wind clan immediately hugged him from all sides. While the guy was screaming, Gong Yao pulled his face towards her and said that she had never seen a person who didn't like this situation. This woman was incredibly strong, so even with a small amount of effort, the guy could not free himself from her embrace. At some point he noticed that there were tears on the face of the commander of this clan, which were welling up more and more every second. This on us gave him an idea that he did not want to accept, as it was slightly frightening. He understood this game very well and therefore realized that most likely all these women were infected with the poison of the Shenchuan bird. This was not surprising, since anyone who was bitten by this bird would have a passive internal skill activated and would be controlled by these birds. It was impossible to get close to them since their meridians were now very weak, and if he forcibly tried to free them using the spiritual method, they simply would not be able to stand it. At the same time, thinking about this, the guy looked towards his wife and saw how furious she was right now. But still he came up with a plan, and hugging Gong Yao, he told her that he could not help it since he was damn charming. He told her that he couldn't help it because he was so damn charming. So he decided to ask her and Ching Xiao at the same time if they thought that he should reluctantly accept them into his team. His wife's face became crazy, and she said that Hu Jin had not yet married but was already thinking about concubines, and suggested that it was because she was usually too gentle with him. Ching Xiao didn't quite agree with this and added that if the guy wants to accept them, then she should be the first. Then Bai Shiaoqing grabbed Ching Xiao's hand and began to gather strength into her hand in order to do something very unexpected. She threw the girl like a sack of potatoes and at the same time shouted, ordering everyone around her not to blame her for her ruthlessness. The girl flew straight into Hu Jin's body at high speed, and he even lost his stance for a while. After that, it was necessary to make sure that Ching Xiao's condition was stable, and she did not receive any injuries, as did Hu Jin himself. When this happened, Xiaoqing suddenly felt sorry for her friend, and Lin Cheng, who was standing aside, realized that she still did not know her well enough. It was Gong Yao who didn't like this whole situation the most, and she was ready to say so. It became obvious to the guy that due to the fact that Xiaoqing was still a girl, her power could not damage their meridians. It was for this reason that the girl was angry only at other girls and ordered them all to stay out of the way. As soon as she uttered this phrase, energy immediately began to be released from her body from those birds that had bitten her not so long ago. At the same time, tears immediately began to flow from the eyes, which were visually much easier to notice. This energy spread so quickly that Lin Cheng and Xiaoqing lost all their strength and could not understand what was happening around them. Well, who this magic did not work on was Ching Xiao. And the guy knew well that everything would happen exactly like this, so he came closer to her in order to explain something. Having hugged him, he began to speak in a quieter voice in order to expend as little energy as possible under the influence of the bird's poison. He knew well about the exquisite and best technique of charming the Spring Wind clans and realized that now it had been taken to the extreme, it was now unrealistically difficult to bear it. Even the system that now incredibly unexpectedly appeared on the horizon was subject to this technique. Therefore, leaning even further, Hu Jin told Ching Xiao that he would have to hurt her a little in order to help the common good. The girl tried to have time to answer something to this, but Hu Jin immediately bit her on the neck with his teeth. The pain was indeed very severe due to the fact that Chun exerted a large amount of energy to quickly cut through the thin skin on his neck. Everything the guy knew indicated that Ching Xiao was invulnerable to almost all poisons that exist on this planet. Therefore, he bit her in order to drink a little of her blood and gain similar abilities, at least for a short time. Gong Yao was not happy with the fact that a guy was harassing other women in her presence, and she was not yet happy with the fact that her technique did not bear any fruit. So she prepared to attack and shouted to the guy that she would make sure that he died in the arms of many of her subordinates. But for some reason, Hu Jin didn't really react to the many ghostly hands that tried to attack him at the same time. Most likely this was due to the fact that he knew that the amount of blood that he had in vulnerability to poisons would be enough to protect himself. Therefore, he waved his finger. He began to move closer and closer to the girl in order to penetrate her consciousness. And when his index finger finally touched Gong Yao's forehead, he could start rummaging through her head. He witnessed how her mother, when she was still a child, sang her a song about a guest on a camel. She liked this song so much that the child wanted to forget for a while and be in this state for as long as possible. But all this stopped when a man loudly opened the doors, called the child's mother a sinner, and ordered the child to be given to him. Mom didn't want this, so she asked the teacher to wait a little since Yao is still very small. But he answered her that she disobeyed her teacher and dared to sleep with a demonic entity, and accordingly gave birth to a prostitute and not a future warrior. Therefore he gave orders to his subordinates to go into this room and take the child. Everything happened as cruelly as possible, and the teacher tied up his student and 2 subordinates took her child away forever. For what moment Gong Yao returned to today, but only to shout the word mom several times. Then she again plunged into memories, and the second most important memory of her life was the moment when, while in a tavern, a man hit her in the face. He ordered her not to look at him like that, since he knows that she came to the Wind and Moon Tower at the age of 8, and therefore she should not pretend to be innocent. At that moment there were several men in the tavern who were smiling and talking about how they would teach her the truth about what she needed to do to become a woman. Their sticky long hands were removed by Gong Yao for a long time, because she remembered that day for the rest of her life. Then she cried and wondered to herself, was she really born to be a cheap prostitute? Was she really born to be a simple toy and not be capable of anything more? The feeling of hopelessness forced her to agree with her role, and she realized that there was no other way out. So she hugged one of the men and thought that nothing bad would happen if she accepted her task in life. Well, when they all got down to business, she started screaming and asking me to be so rude and not use force. All these warnings were ignored, so at some point Gong Yao went wild and began to strike all the men who were in the tavern at that time. All this happened until each of them died from great loss of blood through lacerations on their limbs. While still in the tavern after this happened, she laughed for a long time and repeated a short phrase. After looking at all these memories, the guy realized that because of the bullying, incredible abilities had awakened in her. When the girl came to her senses, she gave herself the task of eliminating Huene right now. But one movement of the guy was enough to grab her hand and prevent this attack. At the same time, he decided to use a rather interesting technique in order to protect himself. Let me remind you that he also wanted to help the girl, so he began to sing the very song that her mother sang to her on the day she was taken away. This song instantly had its effect, and Gong Yao burst into tears and immediately wanted to hug someone. Even though the effect was achieved, Huene still continued to sing it in order to achieve maximum results. And when he realized that at that moment Gong Yao completely trusted him and was immersed in her memories, it was necessary to move on to action. Therefore he turned his head towards Ching Xiao and gave her the signal that they had agreed on in advance. The girl raised her task and began to turn the damage into fireflies. To do this, it was necessary to focus a large amount of attention and energy and move on to the life of butterflies. The guy also used one of his techniques at that moment, since modern beauty leads to solidity and truth. It was necessary to direct a large amount of focused energy into the girl's body in order for the poison to turn into butterflies and fly out. In fact, this is what happened, and the butterflies were released and pulled out with them all the poison that was in the body of those present. For everyone whose blood had already been almost completely replaced by this poison, it felt like a sip of water in an incredibly intense heat. But this was no reason for Ching Xiao to relax, and she continued to perform her technique, so that these butterflies would not harm anyone. Since these small insects contained a large amount of poison, and if they had landed on someone they would have immediately reinfected them. It was quite difficult for the girl to do this, but she still succeeded and the mission could be considered completed. The guy asked if Ching Xiao was okay after what happened, and she replied that the poison of the Xiankun bird was unusual and would take some time to digest. Everyone around them was recovering from the amount of poison they had absorbed into their bodies, and this also took some time. Gong Yao was grateful for everything that just happened, and for this she tried to approach the guy to tell him about it. But Xiaoqing stopped her and forbade her to go further, as this could lead to disastrous consequences. But the guy who approached his wife said that everything was fine and they really needed to talk. The Spring Wind clan commander thanked Huene for everything he had done, as his contribution to their clan was indeed very great. He saved the people of their clan, and from that moment on Gong Yao could not consider him her enemy. She also added that the Spring Wind clan would refuse to participate in these competitions as a return favor. In fact, the subordinates did not particularly agree with this, but the commander told them that she had made a decision, and it was better to accept it silently. While she was talking about this, Hujin took out a robe from the portal that Aoing created and said that it would probably be suitable for Gong Yao. But realizing his mistake, he began to take out even more things from that portal so that at least something would fit. After some time, Aoing pulled out almost a swimsuit from the portal, and Hujin told him that it would be perfect. But at that moment, Xiaoqing ran up to the portal at high speed and said that this would never happen. In her opinion, only she can wear such clothes in order to show Hujin. Considering everything that had happened before, Gong Yao couldn't really understand what the guy was going to do next. So he clarified and said that he just wanted to give her a second chance. Namely, he invited the commander to join them and promised that with the exception of the clan of the Spirit Lords, there would be a place in the top 3 for the Spring Wind clan. She didn't really understand what Hujin's motives were for helping her, since it was obvious that she wouldn't bring much benefit. After thinking for a while, Chun told her that he admired her courage in surviving a hopeless situation and her pride. He also added that he would rather help some super beauty like her than some man he had met before in other teams of other clans. This idea made the girl think about whether this development of events really suits her. But after a few seconds, she said that in this case we believe that obedience would be the best politeness and the best way out of the situation. Hujin had already prepared an action plan for this case, and approaching Gong Yao's subordinate, he immediately suggested that they wear the clothes he personally sewed and not be shy. Some time passed, and a group of guys were already watching the sun rise gradually peeking out from behind the mountains. Jin's wife told him in a quiet voice that the sunrise on this island is simply beautiful, especially considering that today is the last day of the competition. Despite everything that had happened earlier, the guy decided to ask his wife if she understood why he was helping the Spring Wind clan. But the girl didn't care about that. As soon as Gong Yao left the cave, she immediately said that she and her subordinates were already ready. The way she looked in the robe that Hujin gave her looked truly stunning, and absolutely anyone would say so. But Hujin was especially impressed, and his wife, like Ching Xiao, saw it very well from the outside. The situation worsened even more when, looking out from behind a stone, one of the subordinates asked the commander if it was possible to go out. And when she came out, the guy realized that what he saw before could not be compared. The clothes they were wearing now represented all the dreams that Hujin had once had. And this prompted him to think about thoughts in which he lived for a long time, or rather almost his entire life. He always wanted to make all the posters on the pillows in the house soft and fragrant girls who would always keep him company. And now he succeeded, and he even hugged his wife along with Ching Xiao despite the fact that they had not yet calmed down. While on the rock, he shouted that his deepest desire had finally come true. But someone wanted to stop him, since from the outside one could now see an explosion, which became a problem for the guy. He turned towards the source of the explosion and asked who the laughter was interrupting his speech. The enemy who was on the other side looked very menacing, and it seemed that there was nothing on his body except huge muscles, and his clothes were torn due to the growth of these muscles. Despite the fact that it looked terrifying, the guy still asked him how he was able to lift so many kilograms of iron in one night and build such muscles. But he, straining his entire body as much as possible, replied that their clan was the opening of the passage, the strongest clan in body training, and it was not for him to criticize them. A few seconds later, several more assistants approached this guy, and he said that Jin's abilities were clearly not unique, and he had not yet seen real strength. Gong Yao closely watched what was happening from the guy's back and said that they were also poisoned by the poison of the Xionican bird, and they should probably use charm. But turning to the girl, the guy said in a quiet voice that there was no need to say nonsense, since before that it had taken him a lot of work to save her from the nightmare of charm. And he added that he would be incredibly sad to see the girl cry and return to the old way of life that she had before. While the guy was talking about this, with one hand he opened the portal and several more tanks came out of it ready to go to the enemy. They immediately stopped to fire a salvo, and immediately several exploding fragmentation shells flew towards the target. After this happened, all the enemies were hidden behind a curtain of dust and gunpowder which a second ago had been inside the shell. Hujin tried to peer into the smoke in order to see what was behind it. It became clear to him what was happening there only at the moment when one of the opponents began to run in his direction and wish him death. But at the very last moment, when the enemy's fist was almost near the guy's head, he uttered only 2 words. At the same moment, dark red energy appeared in front of the attacker's body, which in no way allowed him to pass further. Therefore, he had to land on the ground and just watch his prey. A shadow mastiff appeared right in front of Hujin, who said that before this he thought that it would be something like bronze skin and iron bones, but in reality it was different. The attacker meanwhile could not understand how he stopped his attack if he had such highly cultivated animal claws, because even for long-barreled weapons it was impossible to pierce the skin. Listening to all this, the guy deliberately showed a smile and asked his opponent why he was so ordinary and so self-confident. The guy still stood unshakable and asked his opponent, did a couple of shots in the air really make him so mad? While saying all this, he pointed the guns of all the tanks at one target and said that he was afraid that he might not be able to withstand his true strength. Then the enemy gave the order to his subordinates to attack and not give him a single chance. As soon as this phrase was said, at that very second, Hujin, waving his finger, gave the order to the tanks to open fire on the target. Now they were no longer firing high-explosive fragmentation shells, but real streams of blue energy. The wife ran up to her husband to say that he was so fierce that he shot at the soft spots of their thighs. But in reality, the guy was not aiming so accurately. At some point in their dialogue, the girl felt some kind of energy that was spreading completely nearby. But in fact, Linqing was the first to notice the spread of this energy and immediately began to take out her musical instrument. While playing it, she tried to resist the spread of this energy, but she was quite unsuccessful. Just a few moments later, a net hung over the entire group, and Ching Xiao, who like everyone else had suffered from it, noticed that they were now trapped. If at that moment you look into the sky, you could see a man sitting in the lotus position directing all this energy for the trap. And when the guy noticed her, he realized that it was something like Nyorai, whom he had seen in the game several times. This energy was slightly modified, and it seemed that the guy was not limited to just the network that was blocking the group's movement. He also directed a stream of energy that created exits and thereby lifted the tanks easily into the air, and they levitated there all this time. Even the subordinates from the Spring Wind clan, who were still wearing those costumes, held on to each other so as not to fly away. The guy held his wife tightly so that she would not fly into the air, and at the same time tried to peer at the enemy. Since the technique he was using now could be easily identified by the fact that it glowed incredibly brightly. And the spectators who watched all this realized that this network of souls, a clan of jade greatness. The Jade Majesty clan patriarch soul net from Wuzong is at least 2 feet long and the size of a pond. 2 brothers also watched what was happening, and one of them asked if he felt what he himself felt. Namely, he meant that if you look closely, even from such a great distance, you could see that a stream of strangeness was visible in the network of souls. One of these grandfathers used a secret skill and tried to peer into this oddity to understand its essence. It quickly turned out that this oddity was the Shenchuan bird, which had already been noticeable in the competition. Therefore, he said that this bird was a demonic creature that would never appear in the secret area used for competitions. It only meant that someone had deceived the system and brought evil. Haolian noticed that the competition was already pointless, and it was better to stop it immediately. But after thinking a little, his brother said that this should not be done, and in fact they should ignore this violation. The younger brother did not understand why he was saying this, because now, on the contrary, everything had become obvious. But he explained that today was the last day of the competition, and if they did not achieve a result, then everything would be lost. So now all they can do is wait until they determine the winner before punishing the cheater. Muyang was also near these old people and said that this soul network has become a monster of a very high level, and the youth clearly cannot cope with it. The audience also did not believe that anything could save the group until they saw the energy being directed towards the target. They weren't particularly scared yet, but the person who created this network was clearly very uneasy. Since looking down, he saw multiple subtle streams of energy that were trying to break through his defense. From his perspective, it looked as if many stars suddenly appeared in this network and began to shine brightly. But after a moment, each of these stars turned into a thin beam of directed energy which passed through the network at high speed. Then all those thin needle-like directions of your energy rushed through the air, and some of them even hit the enemy. It turned out that the guys used the dispersion of spiritual energy and thus were able to break through this network without much effort. He even had enough movement of one hand to create such a large number of weak attacks. His wife, meanwhile, noticed that the network of souls was broken and now attacks could fly through it without even stopping. But in order to appear even stronger, Hu Jin said that this was nothing compared to what he was going to do next. And what he was going to do was using his own energy to slightly change the position of the tanks in the air and force them to fire. When this shot occurred, each shell simply hit the target and exploded near the body of the culprit. Because of this, he lost consciousness for some time and his body began to fly towards the earth at high speed. Of course he did not lose his life, but while on Earth he asked himself how this could happen if his network was perfect. But then Hu Jin began to approach him, apparently to explain what had really just happened. In a calm voice he explained to him that a net can catch a fish, but it cannot catch a boy with the thinnest needle who painfully craves power that is not under his control. Since Lin was one of the strongest warriors who was here, she thought that a guy could turn his aura into such a thin and tough needle, and his strength was truly incomprehensible. At some point from behind the back of the person who created the net, a purple bird flew out and tried to fly away. But when she stopped in the air to look around, Hu Jin caught her right by the wings in order to take a good look. Holding it in his hand, he said that although this bird is a monster, it looks quite cute. But when the target was already in his hand, nothing stopped him from seeing who really was the initiator. All you had to do was find a target 1,000 miles away using one of the techniques. This technique led the guy throughout the forest and with a green glow showed the direction to the goal. The energy that showed the source of bad intentions moved faster and faster. And it moved like this until it enveloped the man who stood behind the tree and watched what was happening. The guy immediately noticed him and began to move in that direction to talk to him. Having come close enough, he recognized him by his face and used additional equipment to immobilize him. Then he said that he sensed this energy a long time ago and also knew for a long time about the existence of the Shenchuan bird and about the consequences that could come from it. It turned out that the guy was greatly helped by the bad smell of the man, which he remembered well. The girls reacted differently to this phrase, especially Linchin, who asked the guy to stay away from her if he was so keen on male sense. The guy didn't even want to make excuses, and so he simply grabbed the malicious money by the neck and slowly began to squeeze it. At the same time, he explained to him that from a long time ago at Landau competitions, cheating was always a dead end, and this subordinate was clearly not so brave. Well, perhaps he really was confident in his intentions, since he did not undertake to reveal who he was standing in front of. At some point, the three brothers appeared on the horizon, and the Hollians standing in front of them all turned to Hu Jin. The guy who noticed the approach of his friend immediately turned his attention to him and showed him a fresh catch. The other two brothers looked at each other, and this meant that the same idea came to their minds almost simultaneously. One of them began to use energy to summon an object which would then hang in the air for a short time. This object was a disc which was hit by a hammer, and then in an incredibly strong voice one of the brothers said that the first round of the Landau competition could be considered completed. Then the voice added that the participants needed to leave the secret area and return to the main field to show the results of the competition. But in the meantime, Kallian spoke with the guy and said that he should prepare for the next round, and for now he himself would keep an eye on the new captive. The guy didn't really want to mess with him in any way, so without much additional conversation he gave him this man at his disposal. The mirror that was located near the judge's viewing platform suddenly began to crack and shake due to an excess of energy. This is all due to the fact that one of the three brothers sent a critically large amount of chi into it, and because of this it cracked. Almost every team received a personal portal which led them to Earth, where all competitions began. Everyone took turns entering this portal and found themselves at the place where the points were to be calculated. One of the brothers meanwhile said that everyone must show their existing jade tablets, and the top 10 according to the number of tablets will be allowed to the next round. There were a very large number of people who did not even have one jade tablet and were greatly embarrassed by this. The organizer even had to appoint a special person who would hold a sign that would direct the losing people from the stage. There were a lot of people without jade tablets, and this was the first time since the first Landau competition. But still there were several people from other clans who had several tablets in their possession. Moreover, Gong Yao was very frightened at that time, since before the counting began she had practically no such tablets on her hands. Well, when the guy looked at her, signs began to spin in her head, and the person who was doing the calculation said that this girl was clearly in the top 10. Lynching also had a large number of tablets, and the person doing the counting told me that this was especially surprising. The judge, or rather one of them meanwhile, stood near Hu Jin and noticed that the jade tablet of other sex had been carefully counted. While he was trying to explain this, he heard a voice from the side repeating the word elder over and over again. It was a young man who did not look particularly neat but seemed familiar to many. Especially those who watched the competition said that judging by his clothes, he was a member of the Azure Wave clan. The young man explained that he only joined the clan 2 days ago and did not expect that he would succeed in the competition. His clothes were tattered because the misers from the Crimson Cloud clan had disturbed him. This stranger was quite confident in himself and listened carefully when the elder asked him to show him the jade tablets he had received. Having opened a portal above his head, a very large number of these tablets rained down from there, and the one who was counting realized that there were much more of them even than those of Linqing. It was not clear how this guy got all this since no one from Hu Jin's team even saw him during these competitions. Haolian, who was standing next to the guy, asked if he had enough signs on his hands to compete with this stranger. He replied that he did not count these signs, but it seems that he will refrain from such a show as he is afraid of taking up a lot of space. Therefore he gave an order to his subordinate, and a shadow mastiff appeared in the portal behind him and said that he would soon carry out the order. Just a moment later he took out a large bag which endlessly spat out jade tablets that piled up on the floor. There were such a large number of them that the elders did not even understand where he got all this from and where he learned to fight so well. All calculations indicated that Hu Jin still took first place in the number of tablets received. Of course, the Azure Water clan took pride of place, and the elder told Hu Jin that he had priority in choosing the other two clans to team up with him in the next round. The guy said that he had been thinking for quite a long time about how he would use this opportunity due to the fact that he had already taken first place. Therefore he grabbed the two girls who stood near him by the hands and prepared to show everyone who his choice fell on. He raised the hands of two girls, one of whom was Lincheng, and the second was Gong Yao, who was from the Spring Wind clan. But the guy even thought about it when the newly arrived stranger said that it looked like Chun was a little mistaken. He told him that he had taken second place, and therefore it was obvious that with him he had the best chance of winning. Seeing that the guy was perplexed, he repeated this several times so that Hu Jin would definitely understand everything. But the guy replied that in fact the stranger is a little wrong, since in fact everything is obvious. The stranger didn't even know what to expect as an answer, since the situation is as obvious as it can be imagined. He was waiting for the moment when Hu Jin would announce this reason, since it was now of interest to absolutely everyone around him. And at the most significant moment, Hu Jin said that he would not choose him as a member of his team because he was not a beauty. When everyone around heard this, they could not believe that such a strong participant would say such a thing. The girls who were members of his group closed his mouth and silently began to lead him aside. Linqing was the last to go, so she said that despite the fact that the guy didn't voice everything, they would be the first to leave for a break. Now the stranger was left on his own and didn't even know what to think after all the words he had just heard. The spectators also did not understand anything and said that they were very tired after all these battles, and now the best idea would be to just go home. Meanwhile, the elder told the stranger that he sees that he has amazing bones but does not have a big name, which is quite rare. The young warrior fell in love with belittling himself, and this reminded him of the elder of his old friend from his own clan. That man was so talented that he never suffered defeat, and he made an oath when he left the Azure Wave clan. Namely, he swore that he would never go out into the world again unless there was someone strong enough to compete with him. This was a direct hint, but the elder had already decided to ask the stranger in a more veiled way if he thought that Jin could be the one chosen by heaven. But he replied that he did not know the answer to this question, since he was not Chun Hu Jin. Turning towards the mountains, he stretched and told the elders that he was also tired and wanted to get some sleep. Therefore he also added that they would see each other tomorrow when he had gained more strength. A moment later he disappeared somewhere, and Haolian, who approached the elder, said that this man looked like someone. The elder needed some time to think, and he said that he could not be sure yet, but that person was unpredictable, so he needed to be watched. After this dialogue, all three elders pushed away from the observation point, and one of them said that now we need to think about how to punish Mujo. After a short time, the three of them were already in a dark office, and they called a man to them in order to find out everything with him. This man hit his head very hard on the floor and begged him to visit him and not kill him for his mistakes. But the elder who sat at the central table said that admitting guilt would significantly soften the punishment, and therefore it was better for him to answer who sent him. The man thought for a long time but did not dare to say it because he was afraid. At some point, Haolian hinted to him and asked if this man was blind, who still constantly walks in a blindfold. After he so accurately described the customer, the man began to shout that the elder was wise and was very accurately able to find out who the customer really was. At this very moment, the elder delivers an energy blow to the man, and he, losing strength, falls to the ground. While he was lying on the ground and cowardly, the person he met ordered him to leave and not let anyone know about what had happened here. He also ordered him to return and tell his master to wait for news from the elders and not to be too hasty in everything. The man slowly began to leave and held his hand on the deepest wound which was inflicted by Haolian. The counter noticed that the owner was in too much of a hurry, but the second one did not agree with this and noticed that he was trying to test the skill of Chun Hu Jin. Only this time he will have to suffer a little since there will be circumstances that will interfere with him. The action moved to a beautiful tower which was one of the properties owned by the Waning Moon clan. Inside this tower there was also a room in which a blind man lived and played a musical instrument. But at one point the string on this instrument broke, and according to ancient stories this could only mean that trouble would soon happen. One of the workers came into his room and said that the patriarch was calling him to report important information. I understand what day and time it is. The man filled a small basin of warm water and carried it to the patriarch's room. When he entered the room at some point he heard something in his time and it made him stop. Stopping, he looked through the translucent curtain at the man who was lying in his bed. He was scared, especially after the patriarch said that he obviously knew the rules and should respect them. Within a few moments he was washing the patriarch's feet and listening to how he had screwed up in this matter. It was simply useless to argue with this, and he even agreed and added that he was without reason. He also constantly repeated that he was asking for an apology and also asking the patriarch to have mercy and forgive him. The patriarch did not particularly like this formulation, and therefore he said that he was unlikely to be reckless. Moreover, he even asked if the Zhao Hall master was sure that this was not intentional. He answered him that this was really a simple mistake and this would not happen again. Then the patriarch would tell him to stand up. Then he grabbed the subordinate by the neck and asked him if he had said before that he would never dare to betray him. Hall Master Zhao, who was that man who summons wind and rain, is wise and resourceful, and so the patriarch was afraid that he would not respect him. But the man replied that the patriarch saved his life, provided him with strength, and if Shuzo pays for the death of the patriarch, then this could be an option. Of course, the clan patriarch named Kandan liked the way his subordinate spoke, and so after a while he let go of his neck. His self-will was the only drawback, and the patriarch noted that this was the only time and there would be no more exceptions. Then he grabbed the man by the back of his head and said that even though he forgives him, everything will still not be very easy, because in order to teach Hall Master Zhao a lesson it will be necessary to carry out punishment. This patriarch's punishment was very peculiar, and from the screams that were in the room it was clear that the master of the hall was clearly not enjoying himself. The scream that night was incredibly loud, but all the subordinates who were in the room knew what was happening there and therefore did not go inside. Several hours passed, and when it began to rain incredibly heavily outside and thunder could be heard in all directions, the guy was returning home. Even from his gait it was clear that he was severely injured after what happened at night. Blood also flowed down his legs from top to bottom and left marks. He entered his home and immediately headed towards the bed, which was located in the corner of the room. It was unbearable to endure this. The patriarch mutilated his eyes and also humiliated him to this day. Therefore that man a very long time ago promised himself that he would never forgive the patriarch. In a guy named Chun Hu Jin he saw the person who should not let him down and who would be the key to a good life. Meanwhile, in the place where Jin was now there was a calmer environment, and he was thinking about why he was sneezing if the water was so hot. But at some point his thoughts were stopped because a girl's voice from the side said that now maybe someone was thinking about him. It turns out that it was a system that said that probably the guy once considered her as an option for the main girl. She constantly made fun of him because she understood that he would not resort to any action due to the fact that he was incredibly shy. Since virgins usually behave approximately the same, and she also believed that the guy had long been captivated by her charm. Well, her opinion changed when Hu Jin sharply grabbed her by the waist and thereby pulled her body towards him. While in this position he said that the system now looked even more attractive than it did before, and he assumed that it had stolen his life energy. At that moment the system was already embarrassed, and she began to talk in a raised voice about the fact that she would even say that she was a little fat in order to scare off the guy. She didn't even hear that Xiaoqing meanwhile began to come into their room and ask where Chan was. The girl abruptly opened the door to the room in order to ask what he was doing there and if she could join him. But when she saw what was happening there she was so surprised that it was even difficult to put into words. She saw her husband hugging another woman who was in the same bathroom with him in a swimsuit. With a trembling voice Chin Hu Jin asked the girl to let him explain everything. But it seems that she didn't even want to see or hear any explanation and immediately began to cry. The guy came out of the bath and told his wife that this was not what she initially thought about. but Xiaoqing made her own conclusions and said that from the very beginning she knew that Hu Jin liked completely different sizes. The guy immediately understood what she meant, but he didn't want to tell the truth now. There was confusion on his face and he just looked at his wife and didn't know what to answer. Moreover, after a short time he became scared because the girl told him that she had nothing left to do. With just one cry, he tried to stop her after she notified that she wanted to show him her advantages. It seemed to the guy that his wife's body was emitting an incredibly strong glow which would now simply blind him. This glow was incredibly bright and lasted until the moment he stopped paying all this attention to it. And through the pain that this light caused him, he said very quietly that Xiaoqing was clearly not the size that she herself had just spoken about. Of course, a second later, he deservedly received a slipper in the face, and that slipper was flying at almost supersonic speed. Exactly 1 day passed, and one of the elders announced to all participants the start of the second round of the Landau competition. This round was a group match, and a draw would determine the opponents of each group member, and the group with the most wins would advance to the third round. That day Lin Qing used the Senhai dedication song, and thanks to it she was able to eliminate a very large number of rivals. Don't forget also about Gong Yao, who could use purple lightning that reached her enemies in just a second. They couldn't even block it in any way since it happened incredibly quickly. During that battle there was only one enemy left who looked at his brothers and pronounced their names. All he wanted now was to take revenge for them and make the opposing team apologize. But he did not know one subtlety, namely that Chun Hu Jin was already behind him. Turning his body, he didn't even know what to do because he felt all the energy that Chen's body was extracting. Scratching his head, he raised his right hand and said that he was giving up. Chun Hu Jin noticed that the man had a strong spirit. After Hu Jin's group managed to repel this attack without much effort, Yao Gong felt a surge of strength in her body. The guy even noticed that she had learned the basics he taught her yesterday quite well. And it happened faster than she thought. The only people who didn't like everything around were Xiaoqing and Ching Xiao, who were not happy that they were not taken into battle. They tried to explain it in different ways, but it all stopped when they heard an outside voice from the outside. It was the voice of Qingxi, who was lying down and said that unlike her they bear a heavy responsibility for heaven and earth, while her role is secret and incredibly important. The girls, who were still disappointed, did not want to tell her that her role was not important, and so they simply turned away. At some point, the stranger who had just taken second place yesterday said that he did not expect Hu Jin to be his team's mentor. He also added new information and notified the guy that he was their next opponent. Hu Jin has long wanted to see who this stranger is, but it seems that everything was not quite as he wanted, because after a short time the guy took out a small sign with the name Gong Yao on it. This was bad news for the guy since he was the one who wanted to be the one to see how strong the stranger was. But it was difficult for Gong Yao to enter into this battle, since at the same time she heard that all the spectators were shouting that the woman of the Spring Wind clans was simply lucky to win. And she's nothing more than just a girl with big breasts. Of course, she was very unpleasant to hear this, and she shouted to those watching that they were just worthless servants who would continue to sit and do nothing. And after a few seconds a lot of different debris flew into it due to the fact that the spectators were incredibly outraged. Then Hu Jin approached the girl to explain everything and calm her down. He told her that the girl now has a choice, and at this point she can stop, because now she has reached the point where she is already great and has already qualified for the second level of this competition. But Gong Yao could not stop hearing voices from you that shouted that she was able to come so far only thanks to Chun. The decision had already been made, and she just notified the guy that she would continue. She also said that he had already helped her a lot, but now she would need to act on her own. Gong Yao was indeed very grateful to the guy for all the help, but she also realized that someday she would have to solve the problems herself. Therefore she began her movement towards the enemy and said that she should at least try even if she was weaker than her opponent. Then, having come close enough, the girl began to move her finger through the air, thereby hieroglyphs began to appear there. The technique she used was not the easiest, and a phantom bow appeared in her hands with 3 built-in arrows at once. She didn't wait long and instantly released all 3 arrows at once so that they attacked the target. These arrows instantly turned into 3 ghostly dragons which moved towards the enemy and prepared to tear them apart. The spectators very quickly changed their minds and were already thinking that the Spring Wind clan actually possessed quite powerful spiritual power. The stranger, who had so far been a mystery to absolutely all the participants in the competition, only watched without moving as the phantom dragons flew towards him. All these dragons simultaneously began to attack, and the stranger did not even budge until the very last moment. Only when they had almost touched his body did he jerk to the side and thereby avoided this attack. At the same time, he even managed to tell the girl that with her level of cultivation this is not a weak attack. But it looks like he could handle even a stronger attack without much effort, as it only took one movement of his knee to smash the dragon. Looking at all this from the outside, it was difficult for those watching to believe that the enemy was actually able to catch the spiritual body. But the girl was not going to give up and drew another hieroglyph in the air and directed the secret technique of her clan at it. Several more dragons were created which also flew from arrows but moved from the enemy's back. They flew into his body at high speed and thereby created an explosion scattering stone fragments in different directions. Looking through the clouds of dust, Gong Yao assumed that she had succeeded and the enemy could finally be considered defeated. But when the dust settled, the stranger said that in the end these flashy things are useless anyway. The girl's arrow was broken in his hands, and he said that considering her diligent efforts, he even felt somehow embarrassed. He pointed his finger forward, and thereby a large flow of energy began to move directly towards the girl, who had not expected this. It was necessary to somehow avoid this, since now there was not enough energy in Gong Yao's body to block the spread of the attack. But even when she shifted to the side, the arrows that were sent by the enemy changed their course and began to fly at her. It's good that at the very last moment something interfered with these arrows and they fought back and began to fall to the ground. What they flew into was so hard that they could not break through it and were even very strongly deformed. The stranger made it clear by his face that he was surprised that this actually happened. Hu Jin, as the commander of this entire team, said that Gong Yao was giving up and would not continue this battle. The guy tried to explain to her that she needed to stop despite the fact that the girl was screaming that she still had a few trump cards up her sleeves. In a firmer voice, Hu Jin said that if the attack had hit her directly, it would have cut her veins and tendons all at once. This was not particularly convincing, despite the fact that the guy also added that for the sake of a girl's momentary spontaneity you shouldn't be going to give up the life of a cultivator. Still, she was ready to continue fighting, but the girl's voice from the side was able to convince her, because Xiaoqing, who was just trying to address the girl, asked her to listen to Hu Jin and not be capricious this time. In fact, it's quite easy to understand if you just look at the facts they have now. Gong Yao was quickly able to understand that the guy's wife also most likely thought that the girl was overestimating her strength. But in fact, Xiaoqing only wanted to say that she was already gorgeous. Pointing at the audience, she also added that at least she was better than all those worthless pieces of cannon fodder who just watch and do nothing. This approach to the girl was already more effective, and she even became more inspired. Chingi and Ching Xiao put an end to her opinion, which only confirmed the fact that Gong Yao is simply amazing, and she should be proud of herself. Xiaoqing still had something to say, so she finally, coming closer to the girl, said that she should never think that she can't just because useless men said a few words to her. After all, what she did at that moment was already super great and truly amazing. Hu Jin listened to this entire dialogue with special interest and asked his wife where she learned to speak so beautifully. Xiaoqing's flow of thoughts was unstoppable, and she also added that the thought that the guy would have to spend time with the same number of girls in the future was starting to bother her. She also added that perhaps this phrase can be regarded as the layout of the Empress's chambers. And at that very second, the system crawled out of the guy's body and said that this was not so, and obviously first it had to be her. Of course, it was not clear how it happened so quickly and what it all meant. The wife asked her husband the same question, but he only replied that the girl had melted his heart again and that she had just seen the beat. At one point, the guy heard someone calling him from the side, and considering that they were now on stage, he paid attention to it. It turned out that Lin Qing was standing not far to the side, and using his flute he defeated the enemies. She also shouted at the guy that if he wanted to pick up a girl, then he should get his ass off the stage and not stop her from winning the competition. The second round was announced completed after a short time, and it was time to explain the rule of the third round. The top three who will advance to the finals have already been determined and will compete for the title of best. Hu Jin understood that he now had a former ally in his enemies, but still behaved with her as a friend. The elders lifted up a small box containing some kind of scroll. Using the energy in his body, one of the elders began to move him in space so that all spectators could see him clearly. After a short time he made a very clear swing and this scroll flew some distance in space. After a few more moments he began to fly in different directions, attracting the attention of everyone who looked at him. The judges declared that this was a demon god diagram and nothing more than a demon god figurine. He explained that this diagram is a secret left by the ancient gods and people. Many years ago the demon god Fengling entered it out of curiosity but never found a way out. Therefore the task was to find the demon god, and the one you see her first will be the final winner. Lin doubted it and said that if the demon god is a 1,000-year-old cultivator, and even she can't go out with me by the way from there, then you shouldn't expect it from them. But still Halian continued to speak and laughed and said that the entrance to this diagram is not difficult to find, mainly because the demon god is a topographical idiot. But in the diagram this demon god looks peaceful, and obviously no one will argue with that. However, smooth stone walls are fraught with many dangers, which will be the main problem for the finalists of the competition. If they are not careful, they will fall into the abyss of destruction, separating their body from their soul and scattering their bones on the ground. Even those who watched what was happening could not believe that this was all happening in reality, since the conditions sounded incredibly life-threatening. Especially Hu Jin's girls were the most worried, because they didn't want him to go and put himself in danger. But who was definitely not afraid was Lin, who told the guy that since he didn't want to, he just had to make this decision as quickly as possible. The guys admired her confidence and the fact that she was truly a reliable woman and very valiant. At the very last moment, one of the elders told the three to stop before entering there. They immediately stopped where they were standing in order to listen to everything. The old man told them that the ancient sacred scroll had a taboo on external weapons, and the slightest violation would lead to the destruction of the scroll. Therefore, in this competition, it is impossible for any of them to have their weapons with them. He also added that their weapons would be placed in a magic bag and he would return them after the competition. Of course, all the participants in the competition could not challenge the rules that they had agreed to earlier, and they began to give away everything they had with them. The stranger said that he did not have any weapons, and meanwhile Hu Jin stuffed Aoing into a special bag, which he clearly did not like. Halian meanwhile explained to the participants that he made the weapons based on the participants' characteristics. Of these three items, the best participant initially seemed to be the sword that went to Lin, and having tried it, it turned out that the weapon is very light and convenient. The stranger put the cat, which was supposed to be his weapon, on his shoulder and noticed that he loved cute cats, and his mood improved as soon as they gave him one. The most surprised of all the participants, of course, was Hu Jin, as he was given a collar that looked very strange and seemed to have no meaning. While the guy was looking at him from all sides, at some point, he seemed to be able to gain his consciousness, and a moment later he was already on Hu Jin's neck. But still this did not answer the guy's main question, namely, why he was given this particular item. Gorlov came to him with the idea that perhaps he would need this artifact for erotic games with the demon god. Now that he had at least an imaginary explanation of this subject, he was ready to start everything and heard from the old man that the third round could begin. He also had a plan in his head, which was that he just needed to go into the picture and study it carefully before acting. And suddenly he felt a light breeze around his body, which became stronger and seemed to contain energy. This wind enveloped him completely from side to side until it lifted his body and moved it several meters to the side. More precisely, it seemed to the guy that it was only a few meters, because after a moment he was already in another dimension. It was strange that it happened so quickly, but nevertheless Hu Jin decided to take the first step in order to understand where he ended up. But as soon as this happened, he immediately fell to the ground like a sack of potatoes and began to feel some changes around his body. He instantly stood up and lowered his gaze down in order to understand what happened there. It turned out that in that moment that he fell, some kind of energy flew around his body, and now there was a collar around his neck, and he himself was dressed in strange leather clothes. Of course, he didn't like it so much that he started screaming loudly and asking the heavens what it was all about. But having calmed down a little, Hu Jin thought that he needed to use magic to get rid of all this garbage. It is noteworthy that the amount of energy he spent on such a spell was quite large, and with the help of this energy he could easily eliminate several enemies. As the energy entered his body, the leather straps that were wrapped around his body suddenly broke. The guy told himself that, as he expected, normal attacks would be useless against this trap. It was necessary to think a little more about what to do next, but now in Hu Jin's head there was only the question of what the old man wanted to say by this. While he was thinking about this, he suddenly felt small objects moving behind him, but since they were only petals he didn't even pay attention to them and continued to just stand and not move. But these petals were unusual, and rushing near his body they even left several cuts on his face. Noticing these cuts, Hu Jin realized that the world he had found himself in was slightly strange, because the petals have become very sharp. Having looked around even more closely, the guy realized that, in addition to these petals, he had another significant problem. This problem was more dangerous given that the strange shackles on his hands greatly hampered his movements. The energy that flew near his face had a rather unpleasant blow and caused significant damage. Since Hu Jin could not protect himself with his hands at one point, he decided to open his mouth and thereby catch this flying energy. Now that he grabbed the annoying problem by the tail, he realized that it was some kind of small fairy. She was barely able to escape from the guy's mouth and began to cry, but it was obvious that these tears were not caused by a feeling of pain, but by a desire for revenge. This fairy flew away a short distance, after which it began to repeat the same word, which seemed to mean curses in its own language. Then, having uttered all these words, incredibly long hair began to grow from her body, which immediately headed towards Hu Jin. They grabbed her and made the guy think that all this hair was made of steel wire, since it was not easy to get out of it. Yes, it was not so easy, but still Hu Jin was also not a failure, and having accumulated energy in his body, he was able to tear them apart. Then he tried to catch the fairy and grabbed her hand while she was trying to fly to the other side. Now that she was in his captivity, he explained to her that she shouldn't even think that if they were so nice then he would be lenient with them. It was strange, but in fact it was true, and the guy really couldn't do anything to them, especially when he saw that she could cry. Therefore the decision was made to let her go, and the fairy flew away at high speed, never thanking the guy for letting her go. The loss was small, so Hu Jin even had time to think that if Lin Cheng were here she would obviously help him. But the girl now had her own problems, since with a sword and bare hands she had to fight off monsters. And there were quite a large number of enemies here, and she constantly attacked them, thereby trying to eliminate them as quickly as possible. Literally the entire road along which she moved was strewn with opponents, and the girl only wondered where Hu Jin was. At some point in her thoughts, the slurry that was behind her began to seethe, and someone slowly began to crawl out of it. A moment, and behind the girl there was already a large monster, which seemed to be the leader of all those enemies that she had eliminated earlier. Now the problem was of a much larger scale than Lin Cheng thought, and something had to be done about it. There was little time to think, since the enemy had already prepared to attack, and it was probably too late to use a protection spell. Considering that the girl could only defend herself with the help of a spiritual letter, there was no chance of protection. Also, her old sword became heavier with each blow. At some point during these thoughts about what needs to be done in battle, a small white cat rushed across the space right next to the girl. This cat rushed so fast that it created a huge hole in the monster's body, and thereby eliminated it. Looking around, Lin Cheng realized that the stranger had saved her, who gloated and said that he didn't think that Lin Cheng needed someone else to save himself. But the girl tried to shut him up, saying that if it weren't for the sword, which cannot be thrown away, then she would not have asked him to mind his own business. In her opinion, the situation was strange, if only because the cat, which was the stranger's equipment, was a completely normal weapon. But he only replied that perhaps Hu Jin also has normal props, but they just don't know it yet. While the couple was talking, a guy suddenly rushed past them at high speed, and this happened incredibly quickly. The girl turned her head and asked the stranger what had just happened behind her. He replied that he had just seen a naked man flash by. It sounded incredibly strange, but still Lin Cheng asked him if he was sure that there could be naked men in this place. Taking a closer look, Lin Cheng saw that the guy was already at a considerable distance from her, and was completely wrapped in some kind of thread. This scared her, and she already began to think about what to do in order to free the guy. But now it was necessary to just start running in order to catch up with him, and thereby help at least somehow. Moving in parallel, Hu Jin asked his friend if she wanted to save him, since that stranger was running faster than her. The girl replied that if he doesn't see, then she is dragging time behind her, and because of this it's harder for her than for that guy. She didn't like this situation at all, but she understood that she needed to somehow help Hu Jin and make efforts for this. Therefore she stopped literally for a second in order to draw one hieroglyph in the air and thereby stop the chase. In fact, this method was quite effective, since it created an almost impenetrable net in front of the fairy who was trying to take the guy with her. The fairy meanwhile tried to break this network and figure out how to get around it from the side in order to continue moving. But she needed a lot of time for this, but in order to come up with Linqing's plan she needed a matter of seconds. Continuing her movement she again drew the hieroglyph in the air, which meant looking to the northwest, shooting at the wolf. Despite the fact that the guy was now almost completely safe, he still wanted to warn the girl about something. Turning her attention, he asked her to be careful as more enemies might appear further. A little embarrassed Linqing told him that he should worry more about himself than about the one who was trying to save him. But this was not all that Hu Jin wanted to say, since he also supplemented his answer with the fact that there is no need to harm these little ones since they do not need to be broken. All this chase, the girl was only thinking about eliminating those who stole the guy, but now her opinion has changed. She drew her sword because she saw the danger and stopped a little to gain strength. Looking straight towards the guy, she shouted that she would save her right away, but the fairies would have to dodge a little. Hu Jin heard this phrase poorly since he was still almost completely wrapped in hair, and asked the fairies if they could free him. At this very moment, the girl delivered a very strong blow to the enemy, whom she had seen in advance, and thereby directed the energy in his direction. Then the enemy was already practically near the guy's body and could eliminate him at any second. Hu Jin made a jerk in order to retreat back some distance, but from the energy received into his body, he flew to the side at high speed. The speed with which he flew sideways was so great that he did not even understand in which direction he was moving. What was even more interesting was that the girl shouted after him to watch where he was flying. Of course, the speed at which Hu Jin was now flying was enough for him to not be able to hear a word that Linqing was saying to him. Therefore he crashed into the woman who was behind him, and from this blow, he immediately spat out some blood from his mouth. But at the same time the guy realized that he most likely did not crash into the stone since something softened his damage. He suffered a slight concussion and felt that the blow had damaged his cervical vertebrae. But everything became clear to Chen Hu Jin when a voice behind him called him shameless. From the phrase this woman said, it was clear that she was not entirely happy that some piece of meat flew into her at high speed. Hu Jin meanwhile tried to get up and said that this woman is full of vulgar words. At that moment she heard those words that she had not heard for a long time while in this world. Namely, this was the word that Hu Jin uttered and which he often used in relation to almost all of his allies. She explained that in this world everyone calls her mother because she is the most powerful creature in this picture. Of course she knew that they would come that day and was ready for their visit. She peered very intently at the guy who flew into her and looked at him as if he were an object that she had been waiting for a long time. And after a short time the woman made a conclusion to us, saying that this guy is probably her food. It was necessary to note that the woman had not tasted delicious young meat for a long time, and she was glad that this time she was served exactly such food. The guy was not very pleased to listen to all this and look at the hungry tongue of the woman who was moving closer and closer to him. It looked absurd, and so Linqing shouted to the guy that he was still not resisting and seemed to want her to suck the guy dry. But in fact Hu Jin wanted to escape, but there were circumstances that did not allow him to do so. That damned collar that was on his neck squeezed him when he tried to resist even a little. He admitted and told the woman that he thought that the tie-up game would be with someone but did not expect that they would play with him. Then the woman withdrew her tongue and asked him not to waste his strength in vain, since this weapon was deliberately created by the Holian to balance the participants. Looking at the guy, she also noticed that dying obediently would be a worthy death for him. The stranger realized that now was the ideal solution for him and the only effective weapon now. So he simply took the cat and threw it at the woman who was just about to eat Hu Jin. It quickly became clear that she was terrified of cats as she closed her eyes and tried to drive the cat away. All this continued until the cat climbed onto the stranger's back, and he said that his weapon corresponded to his soul. And indeed they were even a little similar to each other, and everything was peaceful until the moment the cat looked at the woman again. Immediately he again decided to launch a new attack and began to jump right next to her in different directions. Hiding behind a tree, the woman told the group that what she hated most was cats and would destroy them all. Meanwhile, Linqing asked the stranger to stop playing these games and let his cat do a trick, but he did not understand or pretended not to understand what she was talking about, since so far he has only understood that it is just a kitten and he does not know how he will help them win. But at some point a realization came to Hu Jin's mind that could possibly save the group. And when the rest of the group saw his joyful face, they realized that most likely now he would tell them the whole truth. But for now it was all just in Chen's head. As he understood when Senior Halian handed them the specially made Horcruxes, everything was pre-planned. These Horcruxes seemed to oppose their vision and opposed how the battle should be fought. And since the stranger was the only one who didn't have too many warnings about the kitten's spirituality, this gave the guy the idea that I could fix everything if I treated this collar as nothing more than a piece of iron. He began to move his finger in space and thereby drew another ghostly hieroglyph which was supposed to help him. The girl who was watching all this could not understand what he was doing and why his body suddenly began to burn. But in fact, in all these movements and in all these actions there was a pre-constructed plan. And it consisted in the fact that you first need to heat the iron to the maximum temperature and then pour cold water over it. Ching, who did not know about all these plans, did not understand why the guy was using the highest kindness of a sea of calm. But things became more obvious when the control began to loosen and the clothes gradually changed back and were automatically put on Huene. His collar around his neck was destroyed and shattered into small pieces at speed. Now the guy had lost the object that was only bothering him, and he was even dressed in his usual clothes. The girl realized that there is an action after which they in this world can receive all the full power and use it for themselves. Meanwhile, the woman they found here realized that it was no longer worth giving in and lashed the cat with a small piece of vine. At the same time, she shouted that she had tolerated the guests for a long time, but they really thought that the cat could do something to her. The cat took quite a significant hit and therefore ran up to its owner to feel safe. Then the woman told everyone that the guests should be taught a lesson since at the point where they are now it is already impossible to do otherwise. Phantom particles began to fly around her body, and she also added that this group was still too arrogant, as if they were going to be eaten. The cloud of dark energy grew wider and closer to the group. The stranger was the first to take action and drew several hieroglyphs that protected him from this attack. The girl also tried to defend herself, but the object in her hand greatly interfered with this. Therefore, even though she tried very hard, the dark energy still quickly moved towards her body. This weapon, which was in the girl's hands, took away a large amount of spiritual and inner strength from her. Therefore, all she could do now was just wait for the moment when the dark energy reaches her body and thereby causes irreparable damage. But a savior appeared on the horizon, which of course seemed to me like Huene, who with one movement of his hand drove away the energy from the girl's body. He explained to her that the blade of a sword comes from sharpening, so something needs to be done with this blade. The guy directed energy along the weapon and thereby split it into several rather large pieces. Now the old sword had finally disappeared and the girl had every opportunity to continue the fight. But we should also not forget that during the time that the weapon was in her hand, he was able to take a lot of spiritual power for himself. Therefore, Huene took the girl in his arms and thereby tried to transfer his internal energy to her through his hands. He ordered her to put her hands on his neck so that the restoration of internal spiritual energy would be faster. As soon as the energy of these two people united into one, the dark energy of the woman immediately began to recede, and from the outside it looked like dawn in the middle of the early morning fog. Realizing that Huene was now in control of the situation, he told Ching that the first swordmaster could no longer use the sword. Undoubtedly, Ching was embarrassed by the current situation, but there was nothing to do. Therefore, having hit her savior on the chest several times with her fist, she admitted that he had caught her. The woman did nothing while all this was happening because she could not believe that this was really happening. Therefore, when her patience ran out, she screamed at the same time, asking the guests what they were doing here. My voice grew louder and she told them that they were only 2 dishes in her stomach. Due to her rage, the harmful energy that was spreading throughout the area had now become more noticeable. But at one point something went wrong and the group noticed it well and tried to use it for their own purposes. The woman began to fall until she found herself on her knees and began to look at the floor, trying to come to her senses. The stranger asked the guy what it was and also asked how long they would hug with Ching. Chun replied that it was similar. After a long stay in this picture, the woman also felt very hard. The grass and trees in this world were all supported only by the spiritual power of a woman, and when she lost energy, everything that was here also suffered. But the woman maintained a confident look and explained to the guy that he didn't need to know this. But still he continued and said that the demon god does not have to be so hostile towards them, since if they want to get out they must come up with a way together. After hearing the phrase, the woman became even more angry than she was even after he transferred his energy to Ching. She began to ask who told her that she wanted to leave, and now it became clear to her that Huene was again talking some kind of nonsense. The girl screamed and rhetorically asked the old man why he was torturing her for from year to year. The harmful energy stopped becoming more and more obvious, and it dawned on her that the old man wanted to get rid of it once and for all. Therefore, she decided to kill everyone. The stranger meanwhile realized that the woman had a very strong demonic aura, and he needed to be more careful than ever. The energy showed no sign of stopping and spread more and more, and the woman's voice became deeper and deeper. All that now remained in the group was just to observe what was happening and think about what to do next. But at some point it all ended, and in the place where the woman stood only a shallow crater remained. She had disappeared somewhere, but none of those present knew where she was yet. But there was no time to think about it, because a second after that a strong earthquake began. Now when the whole picture was in motion, the guy realized that everything could fall apart at any moment, and he needed to think about what to do. Only the three of them were surrounded by each other, and this maintained instability. Things got even worse when the stranger got sick, and he was so sick that the whole team saw what he had for the next dinner. Then Huene walked up to him in order to support his body, and made fun of the stranger, saying that he did everything he could. Now the guy had that cat on his back, and he realized that everything that would happen next depended only on him. The earthquake became even stronger, and the ground under their feet changed greatly. Moreover, if you look closely, you could notice that someone began to crawl out from under the ground, and with all their appearance they were showing their intentions. A stone golem crawled right out of the ground, and to the sound of the shaking earth finally made its way out. Looking at the newly arrived team, he repeated only one phrase over and over again. "Sleepy, so sleepy." It turned out that everything was even worse than expected, and this became obvious after the giant asked which ant was disturbing his dreams. The group was right on his head. And it was this very group that lost one combat unit at the moment when the girl was overcome with gigantic phobia. She very quickly and rapidly began to lose all knowledge and became only a burden for the entire team. The giant, due to the fact that he was incredibly large, could not understand where the opponents were who had just stopped him. The guy even covered the girl's mouth so that she would not make any sounds and thus would not close it. But after a few seconds of silence, the giant had news that was disappointing for the group. Huene realized that things would get even worse in just a few moments. And so it happened when the stone golem notified them that there was more than just one eye on its body. Meanwhile, around the first golem, on whose head the group stood, several more of the same appeared nearby. They also rose from the ground and began to move towards the first stone golem. It was necessary to quickly come up with something, since now the giant could eliminate the fact of everyone with just one blow. Huene came up with nothing better how to stand up and strike with his foot at the golem, and specifically at his unprotected eye. It was very painful, and despite the stone giant's complaints, the guy said that he had seen many such monsters, and now he knows exactly what needs to be done with them. The giant tried to counterattack with his hand, but the guy only grabbed his allies and disappeared in an unknown direction. Then all the golems were disappointed in their abilities, and one of them gave the order to the others to find the enemy and crush him right there. Running away, Huene realized that their opponents were clearly not simple, and they needed to come up with more elegant escape routes. He was also hampered by the fact that Ching was still shy about him and therefore could not hold on to his body much when moving. The situation was getting out of control, and for this reason the guy ordered the stranger to get up and come to his senses right now. But nothing helped him, and even after Huene struck him several times, he still did not regain consciousness. Now he explained that all the problems he is now experiencing with his body are due to the fact that the earthquake just happened. Huene was not satisfied with this answer, and he still hit the stranger a few more times to bring him to his senses. But all these methods did not help as much as an ordinary stone giant who just found the target and hit it with his hand helped. At the very last moment, the team jumped in different directions. The stranger jumped in one direction and Huene and the girl in the other. Now everything was fine with the stranger, and using one hieroglyph, he told the giant that relying on one's own clumsiness was a very losing tactic. Just one hieroglyph was enough for Jinta's hand to immediately begin to suffer from multiple explosions. These explosions grew stronger and stronger, and their number became greater. Huene, watching all this, only now realized that the stranger could use a single character technique, moreover such a powerful one. It is noteworthy that in the Azure Wave clan only a few people have mastered this skill. The guy could not use this moment in any other way, and therefore only explained to the stranger that he was as strong as he was brainless. He didn't understand what he meant when he said this, and Chun will only explain that there is nothing to praise him for. Huene meanwhile prepared to use one of the techniques that he had long wanted to use on several strong enemies at once. This was nothing other than the heavenly cultivation of the heavenly purple golden hammer. Lightning appeared directly above the heads of all the giants which at first cruised across the sky. But then all alone they all simultaneously reached their heads and thereby caused very great damage and eliminated them on the spot. The golem and began to crumble as it walked and turned into a large pile of stones that began to lie on the floor. Now the stranger told the leader of the group that it turned out that the stone cleft in their head is a weak point. He acted a bit like a fool, but in fact he had quite a lot of strength, and this slightly surprised the guy. While he was dealing with all these problems, he managed to get distracted and tried to warn the stranger about the danger that was approaching from the outside. At the same moment, a rather powerful attack from the woman was carried out on the stranger. He tried to show off and even told her that even though his back was to her, he was still trying to remain vigilant. Therefore the stranger even decided to make a counterattack, and by running his finger through the air, he drew an attacking hieroglyph. By that time the woman had already become incredibly irritated by the ants, and it was decided to put an end to them once and for all. But her confidence disappeared somewhere when the voice behind her said that, in his opinion, she was now acting like a tired little demon god. Of course it was Huene who, using a secret technique, summoned tentacles and thereby immobilized the woman. Now she was defenseless and he could easily get into her head. And in that head the first memory was a man who said that the dream of earthly life is nothing more than the moon in water. The woman was always in thought, and the fact that from the very beginning it all could have been a lie, but at the beginning it began everything was different. Because the day came when the moment happened that divided her life into before and after. Then a godlike man approached her and immediately noticed the charming little creature. He began to play with this fairy and noticed that she clearly did not like the compliment that he had just voiced. The girl began to react to his words, and he noticed that she had a very hot temper. He already had a plan in his head for what to do next, and he only told the girls that until his soul returned to the void such cute creatures would not be lonely. Therefore he ran his finger across the space and decided that he wanted to increase the size of this fairy and give her the gift of movement over long distances. Literally in a moment this girl grew to a large size, and she was surprised that it happened so quickly. The godlike man realized that he had overdone his internal energy a little and it had grown too large. That girl was so surprised and so angry that she immediately asked the man to turn her back into a fairy. But instead the godlike person gave her a name and said that now she is a flower demon born in Tingpan whose name is Tinghua. But now he did not have time to waste on such a creature, and he said that he was forced to retire to continue cultivation. In fact, even when the girl was a fairy, she just wanted a little of this person's life force. But later, when she was already watching this man leave, a stone giant appeared and struck her. Her attitude towards this god changed when he stood up to protect his creation and was ready to turn this world upside down just to protect it.